This is a part 2 to a 3-part video about King of the Hill. Part 1 is linked in the description, and unless this video is unlisted, Part 3 is coming up in a few months. You do not need to have watched Part 1 to understand any points I am making in this section, and the video is designed to be picked up and dropped at your leisure, with plenty of natural breaks to make consuming the entire video in multiple sittings more simplified. That said, Part 1 is still included in the description of this video if you desire or intend to go back and view that one. This video is structured as individual episode recaps that are split into 3 sections: recap, review, and wrap-up. Recap is me recapping the events of the episode in short form, review are my general thoughts on the themes and character relations there, and wrap-up is anything I could not find another place for. I will be covering the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th seasons of King of the Hill in this video, but because of the structure of my script, it is not necessary for you to have seen every single episode of these 4 seasons, or even most of them, to understand what's going on. Ideally, this video is enjoyable by anybody regardless of their familiarity with King of the Hill, from the most casual viewer to the most hardcore fan. Season 5. Despite its position as one of the most down-to-earth sitcoms out there, King of the Hill still managed to stand out among the rest by rebuking traditions. Most shows had a resetting continuity, but King of the Hill still progressed its characters from season to season. Permanent changes were made, not as a ratings grab, but as an attempt at further realism and to expand what stories could be told, and with these changes come the consequences. Bobby is much more rebellious as of this season. Many of the plots moving into the next few episodes consist of him directly feuding with people, usually Hank, rather than the typical more subtle differences in their lifestyle. Rather than Bobby remaining aloof to his father's wishes, he starts to actively fight against that lifestyle, though this is not to say that the plots don't play out similarly anyway. Bobby has merely hit his age of teenage rebellion. And so has the show. Fox wanted something more standardized, something that made watching reruns easier for a casually invested audience that would hold up against other shows, mostly The Simpsons. But the showrunner still butted heads with this demand. The end result is that most episodes are still standalone, but the whole season manages to be elevated by a binge watch in a careful balancing act between the two ideals. The Perils of Polling. Hank and Luanne are having a conversation about the upcoming election, where Hank learns that Luanne has no intention of voting. So he convinces her to register at the state fair, only to learn that she is thrown in with the Communist Party, purely because she finds the candidate well-dressed. But when Bobby saves the life of a drowning pig and gets an invite to a presidential fundraiser, Hank considers this an opportunity to introduce his niece to his preferred candidate. A ploy which works, as she starts to reconsider her position because she finds Bush attractive. But at the end of the rally, Hank gets the opportunity to shake the man's hand, only to find out that George Bush Jr. has a weak, flaccid handshake. This shakes his determination to vote for the guy, and he resolves to spend Election Day Christmas shopping with Dale instead of voting. But after Luanne fakes a propane emergency to call him, she tells him that it's not the character of the candidate, but the character of the voters that counts. And Hank rushes back to Heimlich County to vote alongside his family. As principled a character as Hank Hill is, these principles can often be completely arbitrary, if not outright asinine, just as often as they can come across as a strong sense of civic responsibility. Hank feels strongly about every American doing their patriotic duty to vote in each election, and while he's a bit disturbed about Luanne's choice to register as communist, he feels more upset that she's only voting that way due to a superficial reason. But Hank does not solely feel as though it's his duty to vote for a good candidate, but a good man. And one of these arbitrary manliness definitions is a handshake. He makes platitudes about how third world dictators will think America is weak if the president doesn't have a strong grip, but these are ultimately just cover-ups for the fact that he's just as shallow as Luanne is when it comes to this decision. This episode is King of the Hill at its absolute best. The satire of American idealism is put on full display as Hank is put into the hypocritical position of having to defend his choices when they conflict with the way he pushes those onto others. As much as he wants to tell Luanne to vote Republican because that's what he does, Hank also recognizes that influencing her decision in this way is undemocratic and thus un-American. But to try to convince her otherwise through less direct means ends up revealing his own shallow logic as well, forcing Hank to not only confront the idea that he's unprincipled, but un-American. The buck stops here. Hank is tired of Bobby wasting his summer break and makes him get a job, signing up for caddy work at the local golf course with the help of Buck Strickland. But Bobby ends up slacking off all day before hurting a patron, and when Hank demands that he apologize to Buck for damaging the guy's reputation, Buck actually likes Bobby's personality and hires him as his personal caddy. Hank is upset that Bobby is learning poor work ethic from his boss, as Buck never rewarded any of his own hard work, and this culminates in Buck taking Bobby to an illegal craps game, where Bobby is made uncomfortable as he has to wait outside in an alley. Hank eventually catches up to Bobby just as Buck is kicked out, with the boy being threatened for the rest of Buck's bet, and Bobby flees just in time to be rescued by a golf club-wielding Hank, who bails the two out of trouble. In the B-plot, Peggy and Min compete to see who can get to the 8-pint threshold of blood donations to win a mug, despite both women being too weak from the constant withdrawals to properly gloat. Hank has always had a surrogate father sort of relationship to Buck Strickland, using the man's praise as a substitution for his own lack of parental affection from Cotton. This has always been a one-sided relationship, though, as Buck does not return this affection often enough for Hank to get any satisfaction from the relationship. Not that he ever acknowledges the poor treatment, as his baseline for how he ought to be treated is Cotton's aloofness. So he fails to understand how Bobby was able to get the attention that he never got from the man, as he fails to understand what it really was that Buck Strickland ever wanted out of him. Hank thought that, so long as he kept working hard, his work would eventually receive a proper reward. He was merely several years away from seeing the culmination of this work. But Bobby starts to get preferential treatment from Buck for being an enabler, though. Simply accepting whatever Buck does and going along with it is able to get him more affection in a few days than Hank got in his whole life, something that Hank does not understand as he had viewed the guy as a role model, and what kind of role model would encourage bad behavior. I don't want to wait. Bobby spends his 13th birthday with his grandmother and Gary, who begins to treat him like a man as he's come of age in his religion. Bobby returns home, eager to begin getting treated like an adult, only to learn that Joseph has recently hit a growth spurt, now being 6 inches taller and sporting mustache hairs. Joseph gets treated like an adult despite being 12, while Bobby is still treated like his little friend. But at his 13th birthday party, Bobby insists on treating Joseph as though he's younger, trying to teach him how to woo women by showing off with Connie. Only for Connie to be upset at the way that she's being used. While he's moping, Joseph decides to apologize to Connie, and Bobby catches the two kissing when he comes in for his own apology. He rages at the two and punches Joseph, with Min treating the bloody nose only for Joseph to try to kiss her too, though she only laughs at the attempt, leading Joseph to rage and try to steal the Bugabago, taking Connie with him and eventually Bobby too. But when he crashes into a lamppost, the three then cover for each other by blaming teenagers for the incident, putting the argument behind them. Meanwhile, Hank gets the idea to pre-make coffins for himself and Peggy to help his wife cope with not being invited to Bobby's party. Bobby is hoping to be treated like an adult after having been treated that way by Gary, something the guy only really did as Bobby was moping about others viewing him as a child. But Joseph has the opposite problem, where he gets treated like an adult despite wanting to be treated as though he were younger. The new changes his body and mind are undergoing are proving to be unpleasant, not to mention the fact that Bobby seems to be much more adult than Joseph is, despite looking much younger. He has a girlfriend, he has confidence, and all the other things one would associate with being grown up, even if Bobby can't truly recognize how much more mature he's becoming. But in his pursuit to be more mature, Bobby ends up having even less control over his childishness, and allows himself to rage against Connie and Joseph's relationship, throwing a tantrum equivalent of a child, all because he was trying too hard to get something he already had. Joseph and Bobby are both hoping to pick and choose what parts of adulthood they get to take part in, only to end up having the bad outweigh the good in their blind search for more adulting in their lives. Ironically, Hank and Peggy seem to be very calm about entering the next part of their days, happily planning out their coffins that they would like to be buried in, with no sort of existential dread. Spin the choice. John Redcorn, hoping to spend more time with Joseph, volunteers to speak about the plight of the American Indian at Tom Landry Middle School. But instead of reaching Joseph, he only manages to reach Bobby's ear instead, and Bobby is soon moved to create an authentic protest feast during Thanksgiving, an issue as Hank had selected him to carve one of the Thanksgiving turkeys. Later, John Redcorn opens up emotionally about not being able to spend time with his biological son, who is acting distant, and the move makes Hank too uncomfortable to remain involved with the issue. Until Bobby reveals his thanks-taking protest feast, which includes a faux human head, as his research led him to believe that the Anasazi tribe practices cannibalism. When John Redcorn leaves the feast after Joseph calls him weird, Dale tries to comfort him, only to mistakenly believe he's been kidnapped to be eaten. So Hank takes his son and Joseph to John Redcorn's trailer to defuse the situation, where Joseph's explanation of what Nancy told him is enough that John Redcorn calms down and accepts a lawsuit settlement from the federal government for 12 acres near the highway. John Redcorn is an Anasazi American Indian, a member of a tribe which died out over 500 years ago, likely a move by the showrunners to avoid having a complex character come across as potentially unpalatable to audiences, and used as an example of bad representation for a real modern tribe. But these potential misinterpretations are shown in-universe as well as the general reasons behind why these mistakes are made. For a majority of the cast, it's a case of political apathy. The problem doesn't affect them and happened centuries ago, so why bother caring? And for others like Bobby, it's misappropriated knowledge implemented haphazardly. Cannibalism was rarely done as anything more than ritualistic, and more often than not was just an extrapolation of a public execution, no different from what the state of Texas does today. Even the usage of the term Anasazi is likely incorrect, as that was a Navajo word for enemy that is the only remaining language describing the tribe. It's improbable that a group of people would knowingly label themselves as enemies. But this episode is not so much about John Redcorn's past as it is about his future, or his lack of one. While he has an idea of what it is that he wants, both in regards to the relationship he has with his son and the reparations he demands, he has to settle for a much lesser reality, as the truth is much more complicated than a stolen wife or stolen property. Peggy makes the big leagues. Peggy gets invited to substitute teach at Arlen High School, the big leagues of substitute teaching. But one of her students, David Kalaiki Ali, is the star fullback for Arlen and isn't used to having to put forth effort in classes, as he's the team's only chance at making state. Peggy tries to get the guy to properly pay attention in class, but he blows off her lessons, so she reacts by failing him for incompletion of assignments. Hank and the guys from the Booster Club are furious as David can't play if he's failing, so they come up with a scheme to have their star player drop the class and do a hastily cobbled together work-study program at Strickland Propane, something meant to give him an easy A and become eligible again. But Hank feels bad about giving the guy a passing grade, especially after his essay insulted Propane, and he decides to go in front of the board to announce that he should not have passed the guy and will be revoking the grade. But when they go to his mother to inform her that her child is being robbed of an education, she reveals that he's learning disabled and can't retain any information, a farce to make the Hills feel as though they were the ones in the wrong. But after David learns that he's being passed as a mentally disabled child, he realizes how bad his lack of academic accreditation looks, and Peggy works together with Hank to teach him the basics of propane for real. Peggy is a principled person, just the same as Hank. The two have an extreme passion for their area of expertise, Peggy with teaching and Hank with propane, and we've seen in earlier episodes that Peggy is actually a very talented teacher who simply fails to pass on her enthusiasm to her class, while Hank doesn't quite get that others don't share his love of propane. To them, these things are so ingrained into their personalities that the idea someone else wouldn't see the same joy is completely foreign. Hank does not sympathize with Peggy when she fails David, not so much for his bad grades, but the fact that he didn't care, until he tries to teach the boy himself. Both of them were eager to fail him for lack of enthusiasm, as they were also content with passing him when they believed him to be learning disabled. But it's not as though David really is a lazy individual. He actually does care about his future prospects, even if he veils it behind the idea that he needs a backup plan. It merely takes the idea that others view him on the same level as the learning disabled to realize that his reputation as some stupid jock is what persists when jock is all he hears. Football means as much to him as education means to Peggy, or propane to Hank, and the idea that an imbecile can perform at his level is a personal offense. When Cotton Comes Marching Home. While getting supplies for Peggy's Veterans Day parade float, Hank and Peggy see Cotton and Deity out shopping. Cotton has been living at the VFW in Arlen for days without having told them. But when Peggy gets rebuked asking for Cotton's medals, Hank goes over to tell him off, only to learn the real reason Cotton is living there. He's run out of money. He tries to get a new job, but is only able to work at a steakhouse through Hank's connections, being demoted to men's room attendant and told he cannot march in the Veterans Day parade as he has to work on that day. But when Cotton sees his repossessed car in the parade, he storms out of his post to steal it, going on a rampage against everyone who mistreated him up to that point. But when his rampage ends, he realizes that he's no closer to being able to take care of good Hank or Deity, so he borrows a single bullet from Dale and shuts himself in his room, only for Hank to rush over and catch him, teaching his son how to fire a gun. Afterwards, Cotton agrees to allow Hank to pay him back for all the money he spent raising him. Cotton is one of the most proud characters in the entire show, his pride often being the thing that butts heads with others more than any other source of problems. In fact, more often than not, any difficulty he encounters comes less from the actual source of the issue and more from his inability to acknowledge the problem until it's too late, at which point he doubles down and refuses to admit that there's anything he can do to fix it, as it's not his fault for being in that situation in the first place. But pride doesn't take care of your responsibilities, and it's not enough to put food on the table. Cotton has to learn to put away his pride in order to get things done, as it's a feeling that's only holding him back. But then why should it be? While the narrative rarely makes his lack of tact into a positive thing, it still occasionally shows that the world isn't precisely fair to him either. Cotton is mistreated by his boss in this episode, told not to march in a parade honoring him, and looked down upon more than literally by everyone else around him. If anybody deserves a break of good luck, it's Cotton. The fact that he can even remain prideful in this state of living is practically something worth being proud of in itself. So while the narrative doesn't portray him as a great person, it's not as though it jumps into the opposite extreme either. What makes Bobby run? Hoping to get some more pictures of himself in the Tom Landry Middle School yearbook, Bobby signs up to be the football team's new mascot, getting Hank to make him a pair of horns for the costume. Hank is proud of his son for becoming a part of the school's tradition, until Bobby learns that there's an annual McMainer-buried whoopin' done by the opposite school's band. When it comes time for this beating, he runs away instead of accepting the attack, leading to him becoming the most hated person in the school. But before he can turn in his costume, Bobby gets the idea to steal the Belton Armadillo, another school's mascot. He recruits the help of Dale to break in, but while there, they learn that the other middle school plans on stealing the mascot costume from Arlen. They rush back to protect the garbage can containing the costume, and it appears as though Bobby has run away again when the other students break in to take it. But during the next game, it's revealed that Bobby simply stowed away inside the outfit instead, bursting out at halftime and stealing the other school's mascot. The episode ends with him being beaten up for this, starting a new school tradition. As Bobby mentions in this episode, he is willing to do anything to be the center of attention, down to donning a mascot costume, but evidently limiting himself to things that don't involve public beatings. Despite getting exactly what he wants, Bobby realizes that there are some things he doesn't feel like subjecting himself to in the pursuit, so he runs away from the fight to save his skin. But this ends up denying him the initial positive attention he'd been getting as the mascot, leaving him worse off after everything is done. Bobby cares more about the attention he gets from associating with the football team's traditions than he does about the traditions themselves. It isn't until he nearly has the costume stolen that he finally realizes that the two are exactly as connected as they initially appeared to be. He's finally willing to let not the band, but the football team wail on him as he's learned that the positive social effect of traditions are more valuable than whatever temporary attention you might receive from making a fool out of yourself. And this lesson is immortalized in the yearbook at the end of the episode. Twas the nut before Christmas. Bill is moping over spending yet another Christmas alone until Hank takes him to the post office to cheer the guy up, where he gets the idea to buy presents for needy kids. Following this trend of giving, Bill decides to open up a Santa's Village to help out children, and he provides a free service that attracts a lot of positive attention, including some attention from a single mother named Marilyn, who asks him out when she sees how good he is with her kids. But once Christmas is over, Bill keeps the decorations up and continues trying to host, eventually scaring off Marilyn and everybody else. But while out washing his Santa outfit, he gets hit up for money by a slacker named Wally, and Wally begins crashing at Bill's house, taking advantage of the hospitality and eventually selling beer to Bobby, Joseph, and Connie. When Hank finds out that the neighborhood kids are drunk and learns that Wally stole his belt sander, he demands that Bill throw the guy out, who leaves when he learns that he's expected to straighten up. But Bill comes crawling back to Hank for answers when he learns that Wally has been arrested, and torn between being taken advantage of and abandoning his, quote, son, Bill finds a happy medium by enrolling the guy in the army. This episode draws a comparison between the parenting style of Hank and Bill through their children, Hank's biological son Bobby and Bill's adoptive mentality towards Wally. Although the comparison is not entirely apt, as it was only Wally's ability to detect that Bill was easy to take advantage of that drew him to the guy in the first place. But while Hank is overly bound to the rules, such as refusing to allow Bobby to watch a TV-14 show, Bill does not make any rules or standards, correctly guessing that Wally would walk out if he had any amount of resistance. In fact, Bill had to have known from the beginning that it was not an even relationship with the guy, otherwise he would have put up more rules and restrictions at first. And by the end of the episode, it becomes clear that he's failed at parenting. Bill compares himself to Hank, who is doing a fine job of raising Bobby, and can't seem to match his friend's level of competence. But to realize this is one thing, while admitting it is another. Bill cannot admit to his failure, especially after spending so many Christmases in despair over his lack of connections. Admitting to failure would mean that, once he gets close to happiness, he messes it up, such as how he failed to keep Marilyn engaged. Meaning that he'll be alone forever through his own fault. It's enrolling Wally in the military that finally gets him the best possible ending. Having a son figure who will get the same upbringing as him means that he's succeeding on his own terms without compromising his dignity. Chasing Bobby. The Hill and Gribble families go out to see a chick flick, and Hank begins crying in the theater. Peggy assumes that he was crying because of the father-son dynamic of the movie, and Dale teases him for it. But the root of the issue comes from his truck. The carburetor keeps catching fire, and there are other cascading problems. Hank believes that the truck might be dying soon. After a reluctant trip to the mechanics, he's told that the vehicle only has a few hundred miles left on it, and that it would cost more to fix than it would to replace. He tries to replace the system himself, but even after an all-nighter, it shows a lot of issues, which wind up overheating the engine and losing Strickland propane in account. Peggy, still convinced that Hank is emotional over his lack of a relationship with Bobby, tries to get her son to work on the truck with Hank. And there, Bobby sees a newspaper ad about a truck shop that he thinks could fix it. But rather than truck repairs, they're a dealership, and Hank lashes out at Bobby for wasting his time when the truck finally stalls on some train tracks. It's destroyed when he can't start it up again in time, and Hank goes back to the dealership to call a cab. But when Bobby decides to walk home alone in the rain, Hank test drives a similar truck to his own, and is impressed enough on the ride that he eventually decides to buy it. But not after a conversation with Bobby where they reminisce on all the good times the old truck gave them. Hank goes through the stages of grief in this episode: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These stages, despite most commonly being presented in this order, aren't necessarily revealed in the same order, nor independently. Hank goes through a mix of denial and depression when he first starts to suspect his truck is going to give out on him. He begins to bargain after his attempts to have it repaired are rebuked, and he's willing to shell out for a brand new carburetor among other fixes to keep the truck alive for just a little while longer. And when it seems like Bobby has wasted the last few miles the truck has left, he lashes out in an uncharacteristic amount of anger at his son. It's not until finding a new truck that he can be happy with that he's able to move on to acceptance, not just because of the truck itself, but because of the people he can share the grief with. As much as Hank refuses to admit it, he is a sentimental man. Everybody with at least a little bit of principle is. If you value something, then you'll fear losing it. And Hank values the truck, not just in a monetary sense as he's willing to repair it, despite being totaled, but in the nostalgic sense, reminiscing on the early days following the purchase. If you put 20 years of your life into something, of course you're going to be attached to it. Yankee Hankee. While searching for his birth certificate, Hank starts to fear that he might be adopted due to not finding it from either of his parents. But when he checks online with Dale, Hank learns that his parents are in fact his own, as well as the fact that his birthplace was New York City, New York. He's disturbed by this revelation and confronts his father to learn what happened, where he hears about his mother desperately wanting to visit the city. Saddened about his New York heritage, Hank starts to feel as though he's not Texan enough to continue living the way he has been, not man enough to drive his truck, or remember trivia about the state. But when he calls his mother later, she tells him the real truth, that he was born in the women's restroom at Yankee Stadium during a failed attempt by Cotton to assassinate Fidel Castro. Hank confronts Cotton again, inspiring the guy to finish his plan to assassinate the Cuban leader by getting his guys back together to sail across the Gulf of Mexico. And they plan on using Hank as a fall guy by feigning an apology about not telling him the truth. But when Hank is left in San Antonio with his prints on the gun, he starts to search for some way out, where he learns that the original defenders of the Republic of Texas were all originally from different parts of the US. Emboldened by this, he rushes to Corpus Christi dressed as Davy Crockett to stop his father's plan, and ends the episode feeling like a true Texan once more. Hank takes pride in his origins, so long as those origins line up with what he currently values. It's this sense of nationalism that causes people to value their country above all others, regardless of what that entails. Hank considers himself a true Texan for being born there, and that somehow being born elsewhere diminishes all of his past accomplishments. Nationalism doesn't always make sense in this way, like a proud Texan loving his place of birth despite the place you're born in being something you don't get any say in, whereas an immigrant to Texas actively chose to be there, arguably showing more dedication than somebody living in the state because of inertia. So of course, this is the lesson he learns during the episode. Many of the folk heroes of Texas history were people not originally born in the state, who in fact arrived back when the territory was still a part of Mexico. So a Texan identity is more so something influenced by the things you do, rather than one thing you did long ago, something that could have been seen in Bobby, who was born and raised in Texas, but still shows less authenticity than Hank does. In Hank's own words, that boy ain't right. Hank and the Great Glass Elevator. The alley celebrates Bill's birthday in Austin, where the guys prank Hank Hill into mooning out the glass elevator at their hotel, only for him to inadvertently moon former Governor Ann Richards. But when security shows up to their room, Bill admits to the mooning to take the fall for Hank, and shortly afterwards is seen having dinner with Richards. As it turns out, she was impressed by Bill taking the fall for his friend, and was smitten, with the two going to formal events for a time afterwards. But the attention Bill is receiving is discovered by Lenore, his ex-wife, and she shows up at an event to try to ruin the relationship, convincing Bill to cheat on Ann Richards. When she catches him talking to Lenore on the phone during a Rangers game, Ann Richards breaks up with him, something Bill announces to Lenore later at his birthday party, which upon hearing, causes her to lose interest, leaving Bill with neither woman. Meanwhile, Bobby and Peggy have charcoal-grilled burgers at Luanne's end-of-semester party, and they love the taste, sneaking out to grill more behind Hank's back. But when he finds charcoal in his house, Hank is upset and forces Peggy to choose between him and the other fuel, and Peggy chooses her husband. Bill has never gotten over the departure of Lenore, a repeated aspect of his character, and up to this point, the reason for his breakup was never exactly clear. At times, it was Bill's poor hygiene, bad physique, and lack of drive in his profession that drove Lenore away, but other times portrayed Lenore as a terrible person, cheating on Bill constantly and taking advantage of the guy. It really depended on how Bill was characterized in that episode. But as of now, it's Lenore who is portrayed as the problem, being petty enough not just to ruin Bill's mental health with the breakup, but to go back and finish the job when it looks like he started to recover. As the show has progressed, the writers have a more solid idea of who each character is, their personality being set in stone more as they learn what plots work and which don't. Many episodes in the past were mean to Bill, but in the more recent seasons his faults are a lot more complex. Bill's still not a great guy, but it's implied that this is in part a result of a spiral of depression that started around the time he was with his first wife. Likewise, we see the relationship between Peggy and Hank become more solidified. While they might not be perfect for each other, they're still as good as anyone can hope to do. Perfection is an unrealistic ideal, just as Ann Richards was perfect for Bill, but he still had many personal issues to resolve before he would deserve to end up with her. Now, who's the dummy? After wowing a retired ventriloquist, Jerry Popper, Bobby inherits Chip, his old carved figure. Bobby begins to work on a puppeteering act, much to the disturbance of Hank, but as Bobby starts to research more and more for the role, he starts to teach himself the basics of sports. Soon, Chip and Bobby are accepted alongside Hank and the guys as they go out for games, but it's soon learned that Hank prefers the company of Chip to Bobby. Bobby asks Jerry Popper for advice about the puppet being more popular than he is, and learns from the expert that that's just how the business goes. So Bobby resigns to letting the show go on, even if he's only at the edge of the spotlight. But when Dale, who is terrified of puppets and has been plotting Chip's destruction since the start of the second act, steals and destroys Chip, Hank gets the idea to simply craft a new, better puppet. Dubbed Chip 2.0, Hank starts to spend more time with the figure than with Bobby. But after Peggy points out that he's neglecting his son, Hank decides to go back to work, shaping the new dummy to look like Bobby instead. Bobby and Hank have always struggled to find some sort of common ground between their interests. Bobby doesn't care about the things Hank values, and vice versa. But here, Bobby ends up taking an interest in sports, not because he enjoys watching them, but because he's trying to get in character for a role. After seeing how much his father likes the new knowledge, he continues to research out of an interest in getting to spend more time with his dad. This works out, though Bobby isn't actually the center of attention. He didn't merely want to spend time with Hank, he wanted to get closer to him, and the puppet in between the family members is an obstacle to that. But Hank too feels the same way, even if he's a bit slower to realize. He enjoys the new companion in Chip, but ultimately values the time he's spending with Bobby. In fact, he views the barrier of the puppet as an acceptable middleman for the two, happy that he gets to talk sports with anyone. It's not until realizing that Bobby's take on the situation is different from his own that he finally realizes the issue with this newfound bond. It's not that Hank really didn't like the puppet more than his own son, but what the puppet represented, and that's something that you don't need a carved figure to achieve. Oh yeah. A new hire at Strickland, Tammy Duval, messes some things up that force Hank to miss a lunch date with Peggy, so Peggy goes with Tammy instead. While out, they start to bond over Peggy's teaching experience and Tammy's lack of a good role model, resulting in Peggy inviting Tammy to stay with them while she works on getting her GED. Hank is unsure about letting Peggy's new friend stay with them, but Tammy's able to pay rent and buys a few gifts for Hank, winning him over. Eventually, Hank tries to get her a steady boyfriend and starts to take her along on his propane route, with Tammy dating many of the men he introduces her to. But things take a turn when Alabaster Jones, Tammy's old manager, arrives in Arlen wanting his girl back, revealing at the same time that he was her old pimp. Hank is mortified by the fact that he let a prostitute into his home and accepted gifts from her, demanding she leave at once. But when Tammy reveals that she genuinely wants to get out of her old ways and keep learning with Peggy, Hank relents, especially because Alabaster returns to try to pick a fight. So Hank dons the hat Tammy gave to him and plays up his role as the Mac Daddy of Arlen County, scaring Alabaster off before renouncing the role. The idea of taking a prostitute into his house and watching after her is something one would never expect a more traditionally minded man like Hank Hill to ever do. But because her character is introduced to Hank with that aspect last of all, he's much more willing to take her personality up front instead of her career. In this way, by the time he finds out that she's a sex worker, he's not so much upset but weirded out by the revelation, the only anger he feels towards her being a result of the fact that she lied about it to him instead of being truthful. Though being truthful would have gotten her kicked out of the house in the first place, so deception was her only option, even if it was something that she only settled on by a mistake of judgment, rather than out of malice. And of course, if there's anybody who would be easy to fool in this way, it would be Hank Hill. He's so honest a guy that the idea of Peggy befriending a sex worker never even crosses his mind, and the writing of King of the Hill is strongest when it uses the differences between its cast and audience in this way. Much of the episode's humor comes from the dramatic irony between Hank's actions and the later revelation, donning a pimp's hat and Cadillac with no understanding of the image the usually straight-laced Hank Hill is projecting. The Exterminator. After passing out from inhaling too much poison, Dale Gribble is told by a doctor that he has to stop being around toxic chemicals or he may die. So he's forced to quit the extermination game, giving him ample free time to sit around the house, helping Joseph with his science project of raising roaches. But all the sitting around is hurting his love life, and so Hank pulls a few strings to get him a job at an adhesives company. But all the stresses of his 9 to 5 are wearing him out, and he begins to lose his temper at his friends and family, until he overhears 2 women in HR speaking about their inability to fire a man who's been at the company a long time. Dale steps in and fires the man for them, cutting him off so efficiently that they decide to make him a full-time assistant manager of human resources, the firing guy. He gets his spark back with the new promotion, but when his friends and family learn of what his actual promotion entails, they're too put off by the job to go back to the way things were. When Joseph shows up to pick up his science project from Dale's office, they learn that the roaches have escaped, and, still unable to use poison, Dale simply smashes all of the insects by hand. This makes him rediscover the love he had of his old job, and he quits to return to the life of an exterminator. Despite, or maybe because of, his eccentricities, it might be strange to imagine that Dale Gribble is actually one of the most well-adjusted members of the cast of King of the Hill. Like Hank, he has a job that he's extraordinarily passionate about, and hobbies outside of work that he can enjoy too. As such, he has a high level of what you might call bliss to balance in life so many things. When you can enjoy what you do for a living and then come home to something else you also look forward to, you'll avoid things like burnout or a sense of lacking fulfillment. So Dale losing his exterminator job also means that he loses his sense of purpose, and without this, the balance to the rest of his life is thrown off as well. He spends too much time on his hobbies to the detriment of his home life, and while Hank is somewhat accurate in guessing that he just needs some steady work to bring meaning back to his career, Hank underestimated just how fulfilling the exterminator work was to his friend. It wasn't about the career itself, but the sense of satisfaction that came with it. Luanne Virgin 2.0. After breaking up with her newest boyfriend, Luanne is lamenting her failures in dating, mentioning that she slept with men before marriage. This disturbs Hank, who waited, and he takes Luanne to church where he and Peggy learn of a born-again virgin program that the church hosts where they can sponsor Luanne. During a sponsorship meeting, Hank meets a repressed man named Rhett, and Peggy reveals that she slept with another man before marrying Hank. They proceed with the ceremony, and Luanne becomes obsessed with her newfound virginity. But Hank and Peggy are worried about whether she can continue to repress her urges, and Hank sets her up with Rhett. The two quickly feel a sense of lust and, only 2 days after meeting, decide to get married. While Peggy is trying to explain why this is a bad idea, Luanne reveals to Hank that Peggy didn't wait the way that he did, causing them to argue and separate for a while. But the next night, when Peggy laments her mistake to Luanne after she and Hank catch the engaged couple in Rhett's van, Luanne is finally gotten through to, and she cancels the wedding so Peggy can become born again as well. The sight of her in the soaked white clothing encouraging Hank to forgive her so they can reconsummate their marriage. Hank is repressed enough to the point of feeling extreme discomfort by any and all means of fornication, only begrudgingly going through with some of the ceremony alongside Luanne out of his concern for her. But Hank himself does not view this as a problem. In fact, to him, it's everyone else's frankness with the discussion that he sees as abnormal. Hank himself being one of the few sane ones for his level of repression. This is why, when he meets Rhett, he doesn't consider the guy to be as off-putting as perhaps he should have. The man clearly had a few hang-ups about his relationships in the past, but Hank being Hank, these were viewed as pretty healthy reactions. It wasn't until Luanne got engaged to the guy so quickly that Hank finally realized what was really going on. The two were rushing into a commitment purely out of a sense of lust, something Hank was completely unable to relate to. And like most things he doesn't understand, Hank is against everything about it. He assumes Peggy has his back on the subject, which she does, but after learning about her fling before their marriage, he's too blinded by his disgust to bother realizing this, even after Peggy tells everyone how much of a mistake it would have been not to marry Hank. Hank's choice. Bobby begins sneezing constantly, and after Peggy takes him to the doctors for an allergy test, the family learns that he's allergic to pet dander, specifically Ladybird. So Hank has to make the tough decision to build a doghouse for the dog, somewhere to put her away so she stops triggering Bobby's allergies. But Ladybird refuses to go into the house, and Bobby is still sneezing, so Hank gets the idea to let Bobby stay in the doghouse while Ladybird stays with them. Bobby is thrilled about this new idea, finally having a place of his own, but the neighbors start to make fun of the Hill family, while Bobby slowly starts to behave more dog-like to the disgust of Connie. And as Bobby has begun to fake symptoms to keep his new place, he's long since gotten over the allergies, the Hills are eventually forced to give away Ladybird to Bill and get their house totally steam cleaned out. Eventually, Bobby sees how much it's tearing up Hank to not have a dog or a son, and so he feigns finding some combination of pills that works so the family can be together again. Ladybird and Bobby are shown to be equivalent in Hank's mind, the two both being 13 years old and becoming additions to the Hill family at around the same time. Earlier seasons have shown that the two are directly connected as well. Ladybird being around the house was what reinvigorated the Hills' relationship and drive to conceive. So in this episode we have Hank forced to choose between one or the other, and he picks Ladybird. While it at first sounds like Hank is picking his dog over his son, there are still other contributing factors as to how this decision was made. Bobby himself influences the choice. Ladybird is 13 in dog years and much more dependent on Hank for support, whereas Bobby is 13 in human years and eager for a little bit of independence from his family. So when the doghouse arrangement is made, Bobby and Hank are both quick to come to the same conclusion, a happy ending for both people. It's not until the reality of this situation is made apparent that the social consequences of treating your son like a dog and vice versa are clear. The odd behavior, something Hank reviles above all else, is getting them negative attention. And so Hank, with the decision weighing on him a second time, eventually chooses to go to extreme lengths for Bobby. It's just up to the boy whether or not to accept this outcome. It's not easy being green. Bobby is writing environmental court tickets on the behest of his teacher, Mr. McKay. Hank is annoyed by his son's new environmentalist obsession and goes to one of these mock courts as it's a part of his son's grade. But there, he learns that Arlen intends to drain the quarry for a new landfill, something which he is firmly against. As it turns out, Hank, Bill, and Dale stole Boomhauer's car and went for a joyride decades ago, crashing it into the quarry and then lying about what happened. So Hank tells the other guys and they volunteer to help Mr. McKay's protest in order to prevent their joyride from being discovered. But when the city ignores their petition, they opt to simply lift the car out of the quarry to hide it. The environmentalists from before arrive at the quarry in time to see their attempts and mistake it for a protective barrier, joining in on the perceived blockade. Hank plays along for a time, but when Bobby overhears the real reason his father was there, he calls Boomhauer himself to reveal the truth. In the end, the police arrive and Hank pleads for Bobby to be let off the hook, getting arrested himself, while Boomhauer gives Bobby a ride home, telling the boy to let bygones be bygones. Hank Hill does not consider himself an environmentalist, to the point that this has become a part of his identity. He sells propane and loves to grill, so any attempts to preserve the environment are viewed to him as a personal attack. It doesn't help that McKay and his yoga group are willing to make it a personal attack whenever they denigrate the Hill family for their wastefulness. If you want to convince somebody of something, anything, it helps if you don't act as though you are looking down on them. Of course, it doesn't help that Hank is just as willing to resort to insults first when defending himself, but that's not the main point of this episode. Hank only buys into environmentalism in order to preserve his self-interests. He and the other guys try to prevent Boomhauer from learning not only that they wrecked his car, but that they lied about it. And in lying about it, they also hurt Bobby, who for once had believed that he'd managed to convince his dad of anything. So on top of Bobby learning that he and Hank weren't really bonding, Hank also reveals to Boomhauer another lie, hurting his reputability in multiple different ways as each lie reveals another. The trouble with Gribbles. Nancy celebrates her 40th birthday at the spa with her husband, nervous over her age and the way it might prevent her from continuing her career as the weather girl, a fear that comes true when Luanne is brought in to replace her on short notice, taking the job full-time. Nancy insists that she get plastic surgery to look younger, but as it's too expensive, Dale decides to sue Manitoba Cigarettes in small claims court for making his wife less attractive with his secondhand smoke. He assumes their lawyers won't show up, but they do, countersuing for $1.3 million, and they bug his house with a singing fish to gather evidence. But when Dale finds the bug, he starts to verbally abuse Nancy in front of it in order to better sell the case, keeping her in the dark as he doesn't think that her acting is good enough to go along. But Nancy eventually leaves him because of his ploy, and after getting scared by Bill, Dale tries to win her back, to no success. On the day of the trial, the Manitoba lawyers offer Dale an out-of-court settlement of $75,000, which he rejects, instead testifying that his wife is indeed beautiful and having the case thrown out. In the end, she gets her job back when Dale threatens an age discrimination suit. We often judge others for their actions while judging ourselves based on intentions. This is something at the center of this episode, that Dale assumes his verbal abuse towards his wife is acceptable as he's doing it for her own good, to buy her the surgery that she wants. These actions go against what he believes is the right thing to do, less out of their acting and more because he doesn't think that she needs the surgery in the first place. But Dale has always been willing to take a morally dubious course of action for his own benefit. But as Nancy is kept in the dark about this plan and Dale's true feelings about it, she only gets to see the middle step. She's unaware that he wants her to have the surgery, that he doesn't think she needs it, and that he's lying about the effect of secondhand smoke on his wife's face. So this is where the conflict ultimately comes into play. Dale ends up rejecting a large sum of money from the out-of-court settlement offered by Manitoba, as for him, the money was always secondary. It doesn't take a stretch for his characterization to turn it down, as he doesn't think that she needs the surgery in the first place. The purpose was to make his wife happy, but if he can do that with a grand gesture, then why not take the easier route of apology? Hank's backstory. Dale enters the Durndal County mower races and the rest of the alley enters against him. But as they're training, Hank throws out his back. He's hesitant to get it checked on until the pain is too debilitating, and Peggy convinces him to go to the doctor. While there, he learns that he has diminished gluteal syndrome, no ass. He's told to wear a prosthetic to protect his spinal cord, but Hank is embarrassed about this. And although the embarrassment wears off a bit once he's able to start sitting again, it comes back when the alley discovers his unit and begins to taunt him for it. But when Peggy fakes a propane emergency to get him to go to a support group for other men with the condition, he starts to realize there's nothing wrong with wearing one, and he starts to wear his unit again. But once he realizes that Bobby is self-conscious about developing GGS himself, he decides to re-enter the race so his son won't grow up ashamed. Though the support group is hesitant about how public Hank is going with this. On the day of the race, his unit pops, and he's about to give up until the guys return to cheer him on, donating one of theirs to Hank so he can finish proud. Hank is ordinarily very reserved about anything abnormal coming forth about him. There have been multiple plots about this in the past, as early as the first season. But here, this reservation is shown to have multiple detrimental effects. First, his stubbornness about visiting the doctor in the first place causes his back issues to worsen as he continues to sit on his spine for years, making the issue worse than if it had been diagnosed earlier. Then his shame in wearing his unit causes him to have to give up riding on his mower or even maintaining the lawn, a point of pride for him being done away with because of his pride in another field. And finally, Hank is able to overcome this shame, only to realize that it's having an effect on his son, that if he were to keep living in embarrassment, then Bobby will be raised to go through the same lack of fulfillment that he almost suffered through. So wanting Bobby to turn out alright, he starts to fight against the stigma so his son doesn't have to. It's Hank's uniqueness in being so reserved that put him in the position that he knows just how much this sense of shame can hold someone back, making him stand out among the other men of the support group prior to them learning the lesson from him. Seeing how hard Hank fought through reinvigorates their passion, that they felt embarrassed too, enough to join the group in the first place, and that they ought to stand up for their own rights, or rather, sit down. Kidney Boy and Hamster Girl, a love story. Bobby and Connie take a shortcut to school through the high school parking lot, only to get chased down by the high schoolers, where Bobby has to abandon his bike. When trying to retrieve it, he gets confused for a freshman and sent inside, but after seeing the culture there, he starts to sneak out to go to high school more and more, faking that he's a senior with a kidney condition that makes him look young, giving him the nickname Kidney Boy. But while he's enjoying the life of Kidney Boy, he forgets to buy prom tickets for himself and Connie, eventually faking that she's a fellow hospital attendee with a short tail to justify why he's talking with her. Meanwhile, Dale decides to buy a porta potty and spruce it up, charging people to use it. This porta potty gets used for a stunt by Arlen High, which earns them a concert by No Doubt, orchestrated by Bobby himself. While he's planning this stunt, Connie breaks up with him to go to the middle school prom with Joseph, as he actually has tickets, and she's trying to make Bobby jealous. But when the high schoolers are out later, they wrangle Bobby into throwing water balloons at the middle schoolers, with Bobby taking a balloon for Connie after revealing that the whole thing was a lie. In the end, the high schoolers apologize to Bobby and give him 2 tickets to their prom, as he wasn't able to go with Connie, and No Doubt is expecting to see Kidney Boy at the concert. While slow dancing with Connie at the high school prom, Bobby says that he's done with the Kidney Boy persona, spreading into a rumor that Kidney Boy has died. This is him finally dropping the whole act in order to get acceptance. Because it was never Bobby that the high schoolers really liked, it was Kidney Boy. Part of their acceptance was because of the fact that he was sick and they were taking pity on him, and the other half was that they thought he was one of them. So a relationship built on 2 lies is a flimsy one, and they never truly liked Bobby for who he was. But Connie always has, and she's not willing to go along with these lies in order to maintain anything, as they are, to her, unnecessary. If people only like the version of you you're pretending to be, then they don't really like you, and you won't get any of the positive things that we really need from social relationships. Whenever you're praised, it's false. When you're complimented, it's false. And if you really feel like you're connecting with another person, that's false too. Bobby has had a genuine love with another person in Connie, and to put on such a fake persona that she's dragged along into it too can make the stuff that's real seem less so. Season 6. Jonathan Abel and Glenn Berger were the showrunners for most of Season 6, taking over the position from Richard Appel. Though this tenure was short, and due to behind-the-scenes reasons, they departed, with Greg Daniels returning to run the remainder of the season. Many of the episodes of this season had heavy rewrites, whether this was a symptom or cause of the earlier drama being a question, and were frequently aired with plots different from the short summaries presented on Fox prior to airing. If Season 6 can be described in a single term, however, it's Flanderization. That is, the steady simplification of a character from their initial premise to an exaggeration of what they used to be, often circulating around a single aspect of their character. Starting in Season 6, many of the worst parts of the show's cast are put into the spotlight, a lot of negativity surrounding who they are as people that gets them into worse and worse positions. And these positions are often extremes, things that would rarely, if ever, happen in the real world. It shows a detachment from the realism of the earlier seasons that made the show so unique in the first place. Moving forward, the show was much more in line with so many other animated sitcoms of its time, but while this may sound like I'm being negative myself, this is not the case as far as ratings and audience perception went. Because so many of the most iconic moments of the show happened during this season, the next 3 episodes include the lines, "That's my purse, I don't know you," "Pocket sand," and so much of Peggy's broken Spanish. Several of the most memorable bits from the show are still in its future, the things that people still remember about King of the Hill. To borrow a term from The Simpsons history, this is its golden age. Bobby goes nuts. Bobby tries to revive Connie's sleepover when the party seems like it's dying, only for Chain Wasanasong to arrive and harass him, ending with the guy and his friends forcing Bobby to eat dirt. When Bobby tells Hank about the assault, Hank encourages the boy to fight his own battles by taking a self-defense course at the YMCA. But the only course available is Woman's Self-Defense, where he learns to go for the testicles. The strategy proves effective for a time, with Bobby fighting off Chain and many other bullies, earning the fear of most of the school. But when the boy is suspended and Hank finally learns how Bobby has been fighting his battles, Hank decides that Bobby needs to learn how to fight above the belt, boxing with him personally. But Bobby gets angry with his dad's lessons and he kicks Hank in the testes, incapacitating his father. Con tells Bobby that while Hank is out of commission, he can't be pushed around by anybody, so Bobby stops doing his chores or respecting his dad. Finally, Peggy has to step in to confiscate Bobby's video games, as his usual method of attacking no longer works against her, and Hank tells Bobby that it's no fun when a person fights dirty, whether that's kicking the testes or having a woman fight his battles for him. Growing up, Hank was the schoolyard bully type that gave Bobby so much trouble, and as such he doesn't understand or empathize with his son being the underdog in any sort of scuffle. So when Bobby resorts to fighting dirty, Hank doesn't agree with the methods, as those were the kind of things that the lower rungs of his schoolyard would have to do. It's not until the situations are reversed that he finally gets the new perspective. Bobby refuses to give up his Game Boy when Hank grounds him, the boy knowing that his father's in no condition to enforce the law around the house. Now being a second-class citizen in his own home, Hank finally starts to become the victim to Bobby's aggression, and when Peggy fights for him, he gets a sense of understanding of why the boy ain't right, not that it excused his behavior. Although to say that the dynamics were completely inverted doesn't actually tell the whole story, because while Hank was part of the popular groups in his high school days, he got that way by picking on those weaker than him and being the star of the football team. Bobby, however, was never really respected in this way, just feared. People didn't pick on him not out of deference to the social hierarchy, but out of self-preservation. There's a difference between safety through the social contract and safety because of fear of retaliation. Soldier of Misfortune. While telling a story to the Arlen Gun Club, Dale accidentally has a negligent discharge, which causes the other members to mistrust him, just in time for one Mad Dawg to announce that he's running against Dale and winning over the other members. Seeing how distraught Dale is over his loss of the position, Peggy gets the idea to hire Dale as a private mercenary, to do a simple task so he can feel like a big man again. But Dale fails at this task and misconstrues the failure as Mad Dog trying to assassinate him. Hank, Boomhauer, and Bill go to the gun club to stop Dale from doing something stupid, but they're captured by the new president's booby traps. When they call him for help, Dan stops his plan to flee to Costa Rica and runs in to save the guys. He's captured himself, though as he'd called in some flower delivery beforehand, he often tells a story about using a fake flower delivery service as backup, Mad Dog fears for his life, and the rest of the gun club refuses to go along with him and going down fighting. So Mad Dog flees and Dale gets reinstated as president, sicking the flower delivery on the other guy before taking back his position. Dale has always been a paranoid kind of guy with delusions of grandeur much greater than what he's actually capable of. Ordinarily, this is a recipe for a dangerous individual, though Dale is only held back by his lack of actualization. He has a family, the gun club, and a career to keep him content with his life. Mad Dog, on the other hand, is just as paranoid as Dale, without any of the other sources of fulfillment to keep him from acting on his paranoia. He's the worst possible version of Dale because he actually believes all of his old stories. But in this episode, we see that Dale is actually a pretty on-top-of-it kind of guy, so long as he knows it's all a game. Because there's nothing wrong with a bit of pretend every now and then. Dale might be a doomsday prepper with paranoid delusions, but deep down he knows it's mostly just for show, more of a hobby than anything else. Mad Dog, on the other hand, genuinely believes the whole thing, but this is just as much a source of weakness as it is a danger. Dale is able to bluff his way out of the situation because he's similar enough to Mad Dog to know the other guy will fall for it, while still grounded in reality enough to not fall for it himself. He's just paranoid enough to formulate the plan, but not paranoid enough to try and do it himself. Lupe's Revenge. Peggy is substitute teaching for a Spanish class on the day it's meant to go across the border for a field trip. She insists on going with all of the students, and despite a few miscommunications that result in the group winding up at a butcher's, the kids still seem to enjoy the trip. But after they arrive back in Arlen, Peggy discovers that she has one extra student, an actual Spanish girl that Peggy corralled on. She tries to hide the girl from Hank, who's busy with a police officer stalking him when he inadvertently flirts his way out of a ticket, but Hank eventually learns about the kidnapping anyway and implores her to return the girl. Peggy sneaks her pack across the border and gets arrested, though her poor grasp of Spanish prevents her from understanding the issue until much later when she's calling Hank. At the trial, her lawyer wants to use Peggy's terrible Spanish as a defense, that she didn't understand what she was doing, but after Hank has to accept a frisking from the officer from before, he's able to arrive and convince the lawyer to allow Peggy to defend herself, to the same result, but without having to embarrass her publicly. The gap between Peggy's perception of herself and her actual abilities is one that's been widening since the beginning of the show. While in early seasons, her Spanish was passable with a few pronunciation difficulties indicative of her mixed American accents, in later seasons, her grasp of the language is so poor that she's barely able to string together a sentence. Here, she's so bad at Spanish that she doesn't realize she's committed a kidnapping, even after multiple people are out for blood. But this sort of flanderization does not exist in a vacuum. The trait of hers being exaggerated over the years isn't her poor Spanish, but her detachment from reality. Peggy was confident in the early seasons, even if that confidence was misplaced most of the time. Yet despite all of this, her heart was always in the right place. She believed she was doing good in the world and that her talents allowed her to be a better person. But here, between giving Bobby a script for what kind of praise to levy her way and how quickly she thought she'd been recognized for returning a kidnapped child, it's clear that Peggy no longer has interest in doing good, but being recognized for those deeds. It's a de-evolution of her character that's causing many of her previous actions to be reframed into a negative light, as though she has always been this way. The Father, the Son, and JC. Buck Strickland gets his license revoked for a DWI and has to volunteer for Habitat for Humanity, building houses to get it back, something Hank thinks is neat enough that Buck volunteers Hank to do the community service for him. Meanwhile, Peggy and Bobby are wondering what to get Hank for Christmas when, seeing the strained relationship between Hank and Cotton, they decide to get him to spend some time together as a gift for both. Peggy convinces Hank to invite Cotton to the home construction, but during the groundbreaking ceremony, Hank gets promoted to full-time manager by Buck Strickland, and in his excitement, Hank announces that he loves his boss. Everybody is taken aback by this, Hank most of all, and they're soon back to the strained relationship from before. But Peggy implores Hank to admit his true feelings to his father during a Christmas dinner with the family that they're building the house for, and he does, saying that he hates his father. So Cotton barricades himself inside the house and refuses to leave until Bobby finds Jimmy Carter working on a nearby home, and the former president volunteers to mend the relationship. He eventually fails at making more than a small amount of ground, though as he's leaving, Cotton and Hank are finally able to bond over the humor in the situation, after Bobby reveals he thought that the man was Jesus Christ. Despite his constant behavior, Cotton Hill really does care about his son, only putting up a rough exterior as he too is incapable of expressing this feeling, something that Hank takes after him in. Here, the hatred that Hank claims to feel for the man gets to him, though this is less because of the fact that his son hates him, and more because of the acknowledgement of failure attached to that statement. It's a basic feeling for two family members to feel some kind of love towards one another, so for Hank, who's terrible at expressing any emotion, positive or not, to openly admit that he hates his father means that Cotton is so ill-respected that his usually stoic son is able to express himself purely to tell the guy off. And this is made more pronounced by the fact that just earlier he admitted his love for Buck Strickland, a man who by all accounts is a terrible role model, something Hank has even recognized last season in the episode The Buck Stops Here. So by these metrics, Cotton is a much poorer role model and by extension person than Buck, on opposite emotional extremes as far as Hank is concerned. It's one thing to fail at raising a child, it's another to watch a terrible person to succeed where you failed. There's still an aspect of insincerity that Cotton really only lashed out at Hank after he found out that he no longer had the respect of his son, but those feelings had to be predicated on something in the first place. Father of the Bribe. Con catches Bobby sneaking into Connie's room again and, worried that he's a distraction to her and his own Ivy League aspirations, offers Bobby $300 to break up with his daughter. Meanwhile at school, Bobby and Connie are constantly told by staff to stop publicly showing affection, and upset by the fact that they can't be together at school or at home, they hatch an idea. Bobby pretends to accept the bribe from Con, and the two publicly break up, dating in secret by renting a motel room with the cash. Connie then decides to fail a test on purpose in order to make her father feel bad about forcing the breakup, and gets dropped to the on-level courses where she can spend time with Bobby. But when a note she passes to him gets misconstrued for suicidal feelings, Con demands that she get back together with Bobby. For the next few days, Con forces the two to spend more time together, giving them unwavering support. But Bobby and Connie start to realize that they don't really enjoy this time together and plan to break up for real. But when they meet at the motel room with their own methods of breaking the news, they realize that they're a good match after all. In the B-plot, Dale hosts a pirate radio station with a radius of about half a block, only to sell it to Octavio when it cuts into his dead bug business. Bobby and Connie's relationship has always been one forbidden by Con, and this is the source of the excitement that they feel. It's not so much that they're in love, but that they enjoy the rebellion against the expectations society has for them. Connie feels pressured by her father to conform and be perfect, and by dating Bobby, she's sticking it to him in some small way. Bobby also feels like Con expects nothing out of him, and that by dating Connie, he's proving the guy wrong. So when Con suddenly becomes supportive of the relationship, that rebelliousness is no longer there, and the relationship has to be based off of something else. Because both of them have different reasons for being together, this new foundation is something that's hard to find. Bobby's presence conflicts with Connie's desire to study and make her way up in the world, something that she's not just doing because of pressure from her father, but because that's the way she actually wants to live her life. If she was content with simply making Con angry, she'd be failing classes on purpose and rebelling more openly. Dating Bobby is a middle ground for her feelings about her father's demand that don't actively get in the way of her own ambition. I'm with Cupid. It's the Valentine's Day flower sale at Tom Landry Middle School, where girls buy flowers for guys they're interested in. Bobby and Joseph both get a few flowers each, with Bobby successfully maintaining his relationship with Connie after their breakup. But later that evening, when Hank and Peggy are out on a Valentine's date, Bill checks up on Bobby and scares him into thinking that he's never going to find love again. He starts to mope around, becoming increasingly desperate as he begs Connie to get back together with him in time for Joseph's party. But when she's put off by these advances, Bobby schemes to enter dressed as Cupid for a grand gesture, getting him thrown out. Now, worse than before, Hank implores Boomhauer to teach Bobby how to get back on his feet, as his friend is always seen around women, and Boomhauer takes Bobby to a designer shoe sale. But there, Bobby learns that Boomhauer's secret is that he simply asks every single woman he sees, getting rejected a vast majority of the time. Upset by the revelation, he eventually finds a girl there and talks naturally with her, getting over his hang-up on Connie by realizing it wasn't a big deal. Bobby and Connie stop dating in the previous episode to no greater mental damage than is necessary. They simply figure out that there's no spark there and that they're better off as friends, both continuing on with their lives in a healthy way. It's not until Bill starts to poison Bobby's perception of love that he begins to panic. Bill's attempts at deflecting his many personal issues by claiming they're all just a natural result of his loneliness makes that crippling depression seem so much more common than it is, and this terrifies Bobby into believing that he's doomed to end up like Bill. Of course, his attempts to prevent this problem only makes it worse, as he starts to reek of desperation, destroying whatever goodwill he still had in his relationship with Connie. But when trying to recover, he gets advice from Boomhauer, whose romantic outlook is the opposite of Bill's. While Bill gets overly attached to a single love in his life, Boomhauer has no attachments to any relationship whatsoever, and Bobby's able to immediately recognize this as a bad thing. Because to feel nothing from a rejection or an acceptance of love doesn't make you any better than Bill, even if your outlook on life is much more stoic afterwards. He's able to compare these two emotional extremes, realizing neither man is truly happy, and moves on by realizing that he never had anything to fear in the first place. Torch Song Hillogy. Bobby is lamenting over his lack of trophies compared to his father, who was once the pride of Arlen in nearly having the team win state. Peggy then writes an essay about Bobby to submit to the Olympic Committee in the hopes that he can become the next torchbearer for Arlen County, but Hank ends up winning when the panel is more impressed by an essay about Hank written by his friends. Hank is hesitant to accept the honor, which Bobby believes is a bid to make him feel better, until Hank reveals the truth. He believes that the only reason his ankle snapped in the final play was because he had gloated after each touchdown before, and he was being punished for his hubris. But Bobby cheers him up, saying that he shouldn't feel bad about his old failures, and Hank takes this lesson to heart on the day of the torch running. Then he trips and snuffs out the flame. Hank tries to fake it with his lighter, but his guilty conscience gets the better of him and he can't accept passing on a weak flame. That is, until Bobby remembers that Dale lit his cigarette on the Olympic torch before Hank dropped it, and carries the flame back to the torch, saving the integrity of the games. For his efforts, Hank rewards Bobby with the used torch. Hank feels as though all of his awards are worthless due to the personality he used to have as a teenager. His gloating and lack of tact in winning made him less deserving of the accolades he'd received back then, culminating in a broken ankle as some sort of divine punishment for the way he had acted. He also thinks that the fake award given to Bobby by Peggy is worthless, despite Bobby behaving in a way that Hank thinks his past self is less than. Bobby gets the award for having a good personality, unlike his father, but Hank doesn't think he deserves it. In order to be worthy of attention, it's not enough that you have to be better than other people at what you're being recognized for, but a better role model too, good in skill and personality. And yet Hank winds up failing at this once again when his morality is tested. Instead of trying to be a good person and own up to his faults after dropping the torch, he tries to fake like it stayed intact, not only failing by gloating with the flame, but failing by pretending that the fire never went out. It's Bobby managing to think quickly and preserve the spirit of the games that causes Hank to finally recognize the boy's talents, insofar as his personality. Bobby isn't taking after Hank, and for once, Hank thinks better of him because of that. Joust like a woman. Hank gets a lead on a new potential client, the local Renaissance fair, and he negotiates a large sale. But when he takes his family there the next day to show them around, Peggy starts pointing out historical inaccuracies and offends the king. So King Philip requests of Hank that Peggy work at the fair in exchange for the propane account, and he puts her to work in a demeaning job. But while there, Peggy can't help but continue to fail to stay in character, and gets taunted even further. Between this and the poor working conditions of the other female employees, she organizes a woman's rebellion. Though once the others back out, she gets singled out and put into stocks. So Hank demands that King Philip apologize, and is then challenged to a joust for his wife's honor, with the propane sale being on the line. As Hank has never jousted or ridden a horse before, he ends up unhorsed, losing everything. But a mystery rider approaches and, using the cleaning instruments from before, unhorses the king, revealing herself as Peggy afterwards, and riding into the sunset as the other female employees are emboldened enough to serve a discrimination suit against Philip. King Philip is a misogynist who uses the veil of historical accuracy to justify his behavior. He considers women to be second-class citizens, but believes that it's also just a part of the aesthetic of the era people are coming to see, and that this justifies his behavior. But that excuse wears off the second his actions reach outside the realm of roleplay, and begins to treat not just the characters in his world as second-class, but the actresses portraying them. And this pretend misogyny doesn't stay within the realm of pretend either. As it seeps out into the real world, it maintains that veil of "that's just the way things were" to continue to exist, while demoralizing the Ren Fair employees to the point that they don't even think it's possible to unite and strike. Peggy as a character has always eschewed gender norms, however intentionally, and this is why her relationship with Hank works. Because he's a very traditional Southern gentleman, including some of the stereotypes that follow that label, such as the concept of things like woman's work. But in spite of this archetype defining his personality, he still accepts Peggy the way she is, allowing her to speak her mind and behave in a very 21st century manner, going against the sensibilities on which he was raised. This is why he's willing to forego a propane sale in the defense of his wife. The bluegrass is always greener. Hank plays his guitar in the alley to drown out the noise of Connie practicing at Con's behest, and when she hears the music, joins in, finding a love of bluegrass music. So the other alley guys get together their instruments and form the Dale Gribble Bluegrass Experience, with plans to play at the Branson Old Timey Fiddle Contest. But as the contest is the same weekend as Van Cliburn's Violin Academy, Connie has to lie to her father about where she's going, to travel with Hank instead. Bobby goes along with him to meet one of his comedy idols, Yakov Smirnoff, but Hank is annoyed by his son's presence as he insists that the band practice as often as they can. But the pressure from Hank is too much for Connie, and she runs away with Bobby, who's upset that despite selling a joke to Smirnoff, Hank still doesn't give him any attention. Con discovers that his daughter has run off with Hank, and rushes to Missouri to demand her back, but he encounters Hank as the guy is looking for Connie as well, and they both come to the conclusion that they've been too harsh in pushing their dreams onto the girl, ultimately joining her in a street performance, while the Dale Gribble Bluegrass Experience drags Charlie Daniels in to substitute for their missing fiddler, before Dale is arrested for having assaulted Smirnoff earlier. Hank and Con are much more similar than they think, the episode's message ultimately being about the way that they're similar. Hank is at first annoyed with the constant fiddle playing that Con makes his daughter do, and the less than receptive attitude that the guy has towards his daughter's dream. And yet he completely fails to acknowledge Bobby's wants or talents himself. And in a dramatic mirror, it's Con who first acknowledges that Bobby's joke is good, while Hank is the first to notice Connie's skill at bluegrass. Connie and Bobby are opposites here, not in the way that they act, but the way that their talents are treated. While Bobby manages to find success in the realm of comedy, his talents are completely ignored for not lining up with what the adults in his life want out of him. Connie's talents are more closely aligned with what Con and later Hank want her to do, and so she ultimately ends up not being in charge of her own destiny, as any time she gets enabled, it's for someone else's sake. It's only Bobby who recognizes her talents and then accepts whatever she wants to do with them. Her dream of playing music for the sake of the music, rather than for any amount of recognition or wealth, aligning with his love of comedy for reasons that have nothing to do with his wealth. The Substitute Spanish Prisoner. After failing to be able to show her work while substitute teaching, Peggy starts to fear that she's not as smart as she thinks she is. So she takes an online IQ test, which tells her that she's a genius, and receives an invitation to a seminar for other geniuses of Texas held by a Dr. Vesosa. But Dale warns Hank about this, telling him it's a scam as the same people who make the tests are selling the certifications, and later, phony PhDs, which Peggy buys. When Hank convinces her that the tests are rigged so anyone can get a high score, she realizes that she's been duped, and gets the other scam victims together for a heist to get their money back. She makes a phony gambling parlor out of the Econo Suites and pretends to let Vesosa in on the trick. But he recognizes the scam and walks away with even more of the victims' money. Though when Hank finds out about Peggy's scheme and subsequent failure, he demands the money back, which the phony doctor hides in his room safe. Though after Hank leaves, he finds out the safe was stolen, as Peggy's plan from the beginning was to just have Boomhauer break into the room and steal it. Dr. Robert Vesosa is really just a more applied version of Peggy Hill. Both pretend that they're much smarter than they are, while their confidence can get them into trouble as they approach situations with less wariness than they should have. And while Robert may have more experience than Peggy does in various cons, recognizing the Spanish prisoner gambit before Peggy can finish it, his overconfidence can still lead to the same disaster for him. The scheme of simply stealing from his room is so simple, he was distracted by the opportunity to con even more money off the marks from the first scam. And while the fake doctor was duped by his greed, Peggy was duped by her vanity. She was so excited to be called a genius that she never considered the reliability of having an organization label her as one if they also intended to sell her something related to that fact. Most cons depend on knowing the personality flaws of the person being manipulated. Even Hank is able to be manipulated by Peggy in this episode into using his hard-headedness to scare Vesosa into hiding his winnings. So for Peggy to learn this fact about scams and to quickly arrange to exploit it shows that she's able to use her personal experience to learn and grow, and perhaps she's not as dumb as she was made to believe after all. Unfortunate Son. The Arlen VFW is behind on its propane bill due to losing multiple members to old age. In spite of their efforts to raise the money by selling off old war trophies, they still can't afford the rent, and have to stay at the hills for a time. But Hank gets the idea to meet with a group of Vietnam veterans to recruit new members for the VFW, and get them back to paying rent, finding a group of veterans at a trauma support group. The World War II vets aren't happy about having to share space with Vietnam vets, but with no other ideas they begrudgingly accept. Though during an introductory barbecue, the World War II vets start to trigger war flashbacks on purpose, and Cotton Hill is chased into the woods after he attacks one of the men. Hank follows him there, and they try to navigate to the highway for help, but Cotton's leadership ultimately gets them surrounded. When Hank tries to apologize for failing, Cotton admits his fault, that Hank did everything right, and that sometimes that still isn't enough. Hearing these words and how they relate to their struggles, the Vietnam vets say that that's all they ever wanted to hear, and the two groups merge, after some of the World War II vets hear about the benefits to therapy. In the B-plot, Dale buys a falcon but doesn't train it, and it attacks Bill over and over. King of the Hill shows generational differences all the time, one of the major themes, whether it's Hank, the archetypical baby boomer, versus Bobby, the archetypical millennial, or Hank versus Cotton, who is meant to represent the archetypes of masculinity in America during the 40s and 50s. As the US progressed through the years, so too did the outlook on our wars and the people who fought in them. World War II is the good war, where everyone had a great time overseas, and we were the good guys. Nothing bad ever happened. Vietnam was a war where the US was in over its head, expecting to win by shooting all of the bad guys, rather than understanding why we were fighting at all. And this ambiguity gets retroactively applied, to the benefit of everybody even if they don't want to recognize it. The World War II veterans are shown as rude and angry, and the episode implies that if they took better care of their mental health the way the Vietnam vets were attempting to, then they would be more well-adjusted. And if the Vietnam vets were able to accept that the World War II vets had suffered just as much as they had, and were simply too afraid of expressing as such, there would be a bit more understanding between the two groups. Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret Hill. Peggy is struggling to find substitute teaching work and decides that it's her calling to work as a full-time teacher instead. But Hank offers her a position working under him at Strickland as a junior grill associate, in case teaching doesn't pan out. She searches for a while, but ultimately can't land a job until she discovers that a Catholic school is hiring, but as they're only looking for nuns, she pretends to be one in order to get the position. For a while, her new career works out, though Hank is disappointed in her for not following through on the Strickland position, made worse when he discovers that she's been faking a position within the church in order to work there. After a while, the guilt gets to her as she has nightmares about damnation, and so she later confesses. After returning to Strickland, as per her deal with Hank, he decides to let her go, understanding now that teaching is Peggy's passion, just the way propane is his. I've mentioned before that Hank and Peggy both have their passions, and this episode reiterates the topic through more from Peggy's side than Hank's. She loves teaching enough that she would perform an act of blasphemy, albeit from a religion different than her own, in order to keep at it, something Hank would never do, at least from the perspective of a teacher. We saw earlier this season that he was willing to don tights and play along with the Renaissance fair in order to make a propane sale, and while that's nowhere near as potentially harmful as Peggy's act, it's still similar enough to draw the comparison. Yet, in spite of this, Peggy still knows that it's wrong. Not so wrong that she didn't want to fake being a nun in the first place, but wrong as it could potentially confuse the students she's faking her credentials in front of. Because ultimately, teaching is not something that a person does for themselves, but something that's done for the sake of others. Peggy is often portrayed as a selfish person, but not a bad one, in spite of the seeming contradiction in that statement. She enjoys having her ego stroked as she sets out to do the job that she wants to do, but if that ego ends up hurting somebody else, she at least has the decency to shelf it for their sake. Tankin' it to the streets. Fort Blanda is having their annual war games, but Bill is asked to stay out of them as he's too fat and incompetent to do anything but cut hair. But while at the infirmary due to carpal tunnel, he notices large swaths of his medical chart are classified, so he has Dale break into the base to investigate. As it turns out, he was part of a trial for an experimental drug designed to make American soldiers into blubbery, hairy, hibernating beings, and this explains all of Bill's maladies. He laments that the army turned him into a fat loser, and steals a tank while drunk, driving it to Rainy Street where the other guys wake up and vow to take it back before their friend gets arrested. As they're returning it, Bill wakes up and pulls over to vomit, where the others cheer him up by saying that, since he was part of an experiment, none of the things wrong with him are his own fault. So Bill decides to take the tank back himself, talking his way out of a ticket and winding up back on base. But once there, Dale mentions that the drug was really a placebo, and before this can sink in, they learn that they're on a live firing range and artillery is being shot at them. So Bill sacrifices himself, dropping off the others and drawing the fire away. The tank is blown up and the guys lament his loss, only for Bill to have wound up fine, cheering up when he hears all the good things that they said about him. In the end, he returns to his old job with a slightly better outlook on life. In the B-plot, Peggy tries to memorize the weights of various ice cream ingredients so she can win a free cup of ice cream by correctly guessing its weight. Bill's perception of himself is hugely negative, a self-perpetuating cycle as he allows himself to get worse and worse, his self-confidence lowering in turn, which then makes his life even more terrible. But in this episode, the cycle is broken by a single bit of information. The fact that he was experimented on at first sinks him further into despair, as if nothing he could do could drag him out of the slump. Then, it takes on a different meaning as he starts to believe that nothing he did got him into it in the first place. If it's not his fault that he's fat and hairy, then maybe all the other things aren't his fault as well, and there's no reason for his confidence to be shot. A telling sign of the origins of his problems, as he immediately starts to turn things around due to the belief that it's now possible to do so. But when he learns that he was on the placebo, it instantly undoes everything that had changed about the outlook. And yet, he was still affected by the fact that his outlook changed at all. If the belief that things can get better is all it takes to make things get better, then perhaps it's not an impossible task to start on the journey of self-improvement in the first place. Of Mice and the Little Green Men. Bobby is rehearsing for a performance of Mice and Men at the local library and tries to get Hank to read through his lines with him. But Hank is busy practicing lacrosse with Joseph, as Dale isn't competent enough at the sport. And he reaches a compromise where Dale rehearses with Bobby while Hank trains Joseph. But Hank misses Bobby's play while Dale misses Joseph's tryouts, as they were both at the other event, leading to an awkward moment where they both go out to the same spot for celebration. While there, Dale and Hank admit that they're not great dads, and Dale posits why. He isn't Joseph's real father, although he believes that this is because of an alien impregnating Nancy while he was investigating lights in Marfa. Both men approach their sons to try to make peace with them when Joseph gets it into his head that he's half alien. So he and Bobby skip their obligations to go back to Marfa so Joseph can be abducted. But when Dale tells Hank where they've gone off to, the two men rush to save their sons, and wind up catching them in the desert, Dale reaffirming that he's Joseph's dad after a pep talk from Hank, and the episode ending with Joseph theorizing that the aliens must have stolen genetic material from Dale. Dale finally discovers that Joseph is not his biological son, at least that's the information that he's operating on during this episode, and his reaction to this revelation is what drives his actions throughout the event. He starts to try appeasing the kid and talks to him as though they're not on the same level, alienating, no pun intended, Joseph from the rest of the family, as he's made to feel different in spite of the last 13 years. It's actually a relief that Dale never learned the truth about John Redcorn and Nancy, as it would have been the worst case scenario for Joseph, being denied a father figure, as John Redcorn is not shown to be especially caring of a father, only wanting to be close to Joseph once he starts to feel inadequate. And it's a relief that Joseph is able to come back around by the episode's end, to a point where he accepts Dale once more. His reactionary attitude prevents him from thinking rationally, that and the fact that he's a teenager, and Joseph starts to behave erratically, running off to the desert near Marfa to get abducted by aliens. Both Dale and Joseph have the same reaction, and that reaction is bad. Their mentalities are similar for better and for worse, with this episode's plot showing off both extremes. A man without a country club. Khan brags about getting into the Nine Rivers Country Club despite not being a member, in order to make the rest of Rainy Street jealous after they install a putting green in Hank's lawn. This installation eventually evolves to a crude recreation of one of the holes on that course, though when Khan invites Ted with Sonasong over to try to suck up enough for a Nine Rivers invitation, Ted instead sees Hank swing and invites him. Khan sneaks along as Hank's +1 and attempts to suck up further during their game, where Ted informs Khan that he will only get into the club if Hank is invited first. Hank and Khan both get an invitation after impressing the chairman, but Hank starts to notice preferential treatment on the night of a party celebrating the arrival of a PGA spokesman. And later, he learns the truth. Hank was invited to the country club as a diversity hire, due to being white. He ultimately rejects the offer and the fake words of friendship when Ted fails to remember what Hank does for a living, and returns to the Rainy Street Country Club, inviting Khan to play with them after seeing how despondent he was for losing his membership when Hank quit. Khan is looking for a place where he belongs, although what he means by he isn't exactly clear to himself. He assumes that an all-Asian country club is ideal for a guy like him, as that's the sort of prestige that he associates with the image he has of himself, although people like Ted don't see it that way. Because Khan is ultimately a character caught between two worlds. On one side is his heritage, something valuable to him in the same way it would be to anyone. On the other, his current residence, the well-being of his family, and existing lifestyle. Even if what he has isn't what he wants, ignoring reality won't get him any closer to his dreams, and sometimes it's best to be realistic about what you have in order to be realistic about what you will have. Hank, too, is a character caught between these two worlds, though it takes him a while to finally piece together what's wrong with one side. His heritage as a Texan and pride in where he's from clashes with the class and race of the Nine Rivers Country Club, and as much as it's a place where he'd like to be, it's not a place that he'll ever belong, even in spite of his race. Because when he gets admitted on the basis of the color of his skin, it's an exception to everything else about him. Nobody at the club really knows Hank as anything other than the white guy, and that's not an ideal way to fit into a new place. He would rather be judged on the content of his character, much in the same way that Rainy Street judges Khan on his. Beer and Loathing. Hank in the alley can't get a hold of any Alamo beer and can't seem to figure out why. He asks Peggy to call their customer support line to ask, and while conversing in Spanish, she ends up offered a job as a bilingual call center employee. While inside the company, she learns a few secrets but can't reveal them due to a non-disclosure agreement that she wants to keep intact. Hank eventually pressures her into talking though, and she reveals that the supply has been diverted to Mexico in order to increase sales there. So Hank and the guys road trip to Mexico to stock up until the supply is back on American shelves. However, once they buy a large supply and get sick from it, Peggy then learns the real truth. The supply was diverted to Mexico because it was contaminated, and they didn't want to sell the beer in the US. When Hank comes home sick with the same symptoms as the Mexican callers, Peggy makes the connection that Hank broke his promise not to tell what she knew, though Hank also deduces that Peggy knew about the contaminated beer and didn't stop him from drinking any. In the end, hurt that her company would withhold so much after she overhears a conversation between Hank and the CEO, Peggy swaps out some of the beers in an executive meeting with a contaminated batch, and the whole board gets sick, which finally forces an apology and a recall. Hank and Peggy's stubbornness is a central aspect of their characterization, the resistance that they feel to change being a key part of why they find friction against the rapidly changing world around them. And yet, for all the value they place on consistency and the expected, they tend to react with hostility when confronted by these same tendencies in others. Hank does not want to accept that Peggy is sticking to an NDA, despite agreements of that kind being the sort of thing that Hank usually observes, even when no one else does. It's just that the NDA got in the way of his favorite beer, making it a change. And Peggy is too stubborn to break the agreement she signed, as keeping a secret is what makes it exclusive. If anyone could find out, then it's not very special when someone knows it. And of course, the loss in sales associated with the recall of that size that Alamo would have to have done is too great an obstacle to continued return on investment for Alamo to forego, even if it causes them to lose a bit of faith in their less valued foreign markets. They would rather not investigate the causes and change production style to prevent a future incident, which draws ire from Hank and Peggy, who feel betrayed by a personality trait that they themselves may have exhibited in a similar situation, although it's unlikely either person would go to the extreme of allowing others to be poisoned. Fun with Jane and Jane. Buck Strickland has Hank stay after work to execute the emus on his emu farm so he can make an insurance claim. He cancels his date with Peggy, who had just canceled her date with Luanne after telling the girl to try and make new friends at a sorority rush week. Luanne attempts to go to a few of the sororities, but none accept her, until a girl from the Omega house sees her drinking alone and offers to accept her. Once Luanne gets to the house, she finds that everybody there is named Jane, and they only allow the pledges to eat rice, and they force members to sell jams and jellies while working on a ranch as pseudo-slave labor. She manages to escape when Hank sees her on the side of the highway while he was out hunting down the emus that he and the other guys didn't have the heart to kill. But Peggy, who has been feeling down about not having any friends outside her immediate family, takes Luanne back to the cult and joins up herself when the girls there tell her platitudes about why she's unhappy. When Buck tells Hank to retrieve the emus' corpses, Hank panics as he doesn't have them, so he buys $400 worth of beef with the idea to pass it off as emu. Yet when he learns of the cult and Peggy and Luanne's admission, he instead stops by the campus and uses the smell of cooking beef to lure the starving pledges out of their hypnosis. Cults often prey on the lonely and/or desperate, targeting those who have nowhere else to turn and luring them in with a few niceties that manipulate them into doing whatever they can to keep the positive attention coming. In general, they go after people who are in a moment of weakness, as they do to Peggy in this episode. They also attempt to target Luanne, but fail to get through to her, as her lack of dissatisfaction in life makes her an almost impossible target for brainwashing. Luanne, despite everything, is a very content person. The place she is in life is exactly where she wants to be, so there's very little in the way of platitude that can satisfy her. Even people who are insulting her often fail to make their point. It's an optimistic outlook centered around ignorance of the world and its potential for cruelty, and yet from the same point of her personality is where her vulnerability is derived. Because Luanne is too kind to even comprehend why another person might want to harm her, meaning that it doesn't take brainwashing to get her to go along with the trip to the ranch. Peggy, on the other hand, is eager to find any sort of social connection to the point that she can have that desperation used against her, though nothing can break away conditioning like being reminded of what you're missing and the things you used to have. My Own Private Rodeo. Dale is renewing his wedding vows to Nancy, and the two are feuding over Dale's father being on the guest list. Dale is upset, as during his wedding he walked in on his father kissing Nancy, and they haven't seen each other since. But Nancy, still covering up her affair with John Redcorn, wants Dale to get used to giving people second chances, and she has Hank invite the guy anyway. Hank goes out with the rest of the alley to find Bug Gribble, who they know is a rodeo star, and eventually track him down at the rodeo. The gay rodeo. Hank learns from Bug that the kiss from 20 years ago was a misunderstanding, a cover-up for trying to kiss a waiter, and Hank invites Bug over so he might have a reunion with his son. Over the next few days, the two men grow closer, until Bug finally decides to tell Dale the truth behind his double life and secret partner, though Dale misinterprets this as a cover story for his father being a federal agent. He's unre-invited to the re-wedding, and Dale sets out to find proof of his father's career, resulting in a public spat between Bug and his lover. But when the two make up and kiss in front of Dale, he finally believes the real story, and re-invites his father to the re-wedding, announcing that he has no problem with his dad being gay, as he believes John Redcorn is too. This is an episode rife with gay stereotypes and humor at the expense of some of the mannerisms of its gay cast, though these are minor and put into the context of airing on Fox in the year 2002. With that in mind, this episode is actually extremely progressive in its depiction of homosexuality, more so than many modern shows can manage while actively trying to be. Bug is a flamboyant man, but this is just as much attributed to him being a rodeo cowboy than it is to his sexuality. It's just a bit of camp for the audience. A few of the characters still have a problem with the concept of homosexuality, Bill and Boomhauer cracking a few jokes at the gay rodeo's expense, but ultimately they still show up to the wedding to support their friend, extenuating circumstances be damned. Dale's issue is only with the fact that his father lied, something his mind extrapolated to mean that he had to be hiding something more, as it didn't cross Dale's mind that someone would have to go to such extreme lengths to cover up sexuality in that way. In a state and a time that it wasn't especially known for its tolerance of the abnormal, it's impressive to see a show like King of the Hill managing to resist aging poorly. Sug Night. After installing a propane heater and a hot tub for Nancy, Hank returns home too exhausted to sleep with Peggy. Then, he has a dream where he was grilling in the nude alongside his neighbor's wife. Hank is mortified about this dream, only telling parts of it to his family, and seeks out some meaning to the events with John Redcorn, although the guy throws him out when he learns that Hank's dream was about Nancy. Later, Dale tells Nancy and Peggy while they're hot tubbing, and Peggy begins to suspect that Hank is having erotic dreams about other women due to not finding her interesting anymore. She laments the loss of intimacy to Nancy, who suggests that they try to find something that can spice up their love life, and she gets the idea to recreate Hank's dream. Though because he's self-conscious about grilling in the nude, they decide to go out to a nude beach to live out the dream. While there, the smell of the burgers attracts two young women who begin to ask questions that Hank answers eagerly. Peggy is distraught that Hank is paying more attention to younger women than to her, until he comes back and starts to eagerly describe propane and its usage. At this, she deduces that Hank's dream was not about Nancy Gribble, but the grill itself, and that Hank is aroused by the thought of propane. Repeatedly stated throughout this episode is Hank's idea that he dislikes any kind of change, the type of person to prefer the same old thing. And yet, he ends up putting his marriage into a complicated situation by trying to resist his own mind's desire for something fresh. When he has an erotic dream about who he thinks is Nancy, it's actually just his brain trying to put a fresh spin on the propane business he's been in for 20 years. And of course, once he actually starts to think about alternate ways to heat things, such as hot tubs or houseboats, he immediately finds himself with more energy, comparing his spiel about grilling from the start of the episode to the explanation at the end. But it's not an easy route to get from one point to the other. Hank is so reserved about this sort of thing that he refuses to think about it any more than the bare minimum. Not helped that his initial attempt to find out the meaning of the dream resulted in John Redcorn getting angry and kicking him out. So when Hank tries to hide what's on his mind, he doesn't make any sort of progress, staying in the same rut until Peggy is finally able to push him outside his comfort zone. And although not for the reasons they were expecting, Hank is finally able to wake up to new possibilities, a happier world than what he saw with the same old thing. Dangle Love. Bill sees a woman jogging through the alley and falls in love with her, but his attempts to woo her fail as she's not interested. Boomhauer tries to offer him advice, which Bill ignores to go with Dale's plan of digging several potholes in the alley so he can trip her and treat the wounded ankle. But when he falls into his own holes, Boomhauer steps in and carries Marlene inside, where the two sleep together. Bill is enraged that his friend would steal the woman he saw first, culminating in an argument when Bill goes through her underwear after Boomhauer invites the alley over to her house. But Marlene soon loses interest in Boomhauer and kicks him out, which tears the guy up, leading to Bill to start taunting him. Boomhauer eventually decides to propose, but when he shows her his grandmother's ring, finds out that she has moved on. He's broken up about this, with Hank and Dale failing to get him back into the dating pool until Bill finally steps in and takes him to a lookout. There, Bill gives him a motivating speech where he compares the two men, and Boomhauer is encouraged to get himself back into some strange woman's bed. Though first, he apologizes to one of his old flings. Dale makes an observation about the alley's dynamic, 4 quadrants of married single and cool loser, although his gauging of each person's coolness is a bit off. It does allow for each person's character dynamics to reach more variety in what plots can be done. If there's a plot about a married person in a stable relationship, it goes to Hank. If there's a plot about a married man in a strange relationship, it goes to Dale. If there's a plot about a single guy botching a relationship, it goes to Bill, and a plot about a single guy with all his stuff together goes to Boomhauer. But stories about people who don't overreact to aspects of their love life are not especially interesting, and so it takes Boomhauer being broken up with, turning him into a Bill, to make a story about him that can hold audience attention. And as he gets to become more like Bill during this dynamic, it's Bill who has to get him out of the rut. Because as much as Bill is a loser, he's self-aware about it all, and he still tries to change. That's a more telling aspect of his personality than the man who has it all and doesn't want to change anything, as it takes a lot more willpower to put yourself out there in that sense. We see Boomhauer shut down completely after a failed relationship, something Bill has done multiple times, always to rebound. So he's the best person to get his friend back into the dating pool, as he's had the most relatable personal experience. Bill knows who he is and has both accepted that and vowed to try to be better. Returning Japanese, Part 1. Cotton starts having war flashbacks during a Memorial Day celebration at John Redcorn's sauna. He laments that there's a woman whose husband he killed and stole the wallet from, that he's been carrying her photo around for 50 years and wants to apologize. Peggy spins this into a potential travel article for the local newspaper, and the family is given a trip to Japan for her to investigate. But as the day of their trip gets closer, Cotton becomes increasingly anxious to the point of trying to get out of the meeting, made worse when local paparazzi want to film the reunion for a feel-good story. As it turns out, Cotton is not meeting the woman whose husband he killed, but a woman he was in love with back during his deployment, the nurse who took care of him once his feet were reattached. Hank is put off at first that this is a 60-year-old booty call, until he starts to realize that his father has dyed his hair and bought flowers. He really does love this woman. So they find her address and prepare to visit, only for the door to be answered by a half-Japanese man who looks exactly like Hank. Meanwhile, Luanne is taking care of Ladybird and mistakenly believes she's killed the dog, while Dale and Bill start to fear that the Hill household could be broken into, so they don Hank and Peggy's clothing while pretending to live there. Cotton starts to open up during this episode, the humbling experience of feeling bad about his actions during World War II catching up to him, as his take on the events shifts from bragging about the kill count to lamenting the needless bloodshed. Bloodshed that was done against a more humanized target, as he starts to remember Michiko, the woman he loved during his time recovering. Now, instead of miscellaneous villains, he starts to consider the Japanese as real people just like Michiko. In this moment of remembering his humanity, Cotton starts to open up in other ways as well. His relationship with Hank starts to get better, as Hank begins to feel like his father is once again a decent man. And Cotton, too, starts to view Hank's achievements as being greater instead of denigrating his son for not having a killing spree of his own. Returning Japanese, Part 2. Hank Hill meets his half-brother, Junichiro, though the other man seems hesitant to acknowledge his American family. Cotton regales the tale of how he and Michiko met, and then were separated without a goodbye, and the two families have a dinner together where these feelings get to be expressed. When Cotton hears that his other son doesn't respect him, though, he gets angry and storms off, leaving a wake of destruction in his path. Hank tracks down Junichiro and implores him to help out, as Cotton's actions are dishonoring the family name. And they track Cotton down to a train station where Cotton announces his intentions to spit in the Emperor's face. The brothers race to stop their father, with Hank teaching Junichiro to be a bit more assertive, like an American, before they ultimately arrive in time to talk him down, using their newfound brotherly bond to convince Cotton to put the past behind him. Luanne, still thinking Ladybird is dead, buys an identical dog only for the two to run around and Luanne to forget which is which. Later, while out walking them, she finds two people inside the Hill household and, thinking that they're intruders, calls the police. Dale and Bill are arrested, pleading with Boomhauer to take in Hank's paper while they're in jail. Bobby finds love in an unnamed girl who plays a dancing arcade game with him, but never gets to say goodbye until Cotton finds out about her, at which point he drops everything so Bobby won't make the same mistake he did. It's worth mentioning that in Japanese culture, bastard children are regularly viewed with extreme disdain, not only by family, but society as well, something that had to have made Junichiro's life extremely difficult. With this idea in mind, the episode sets a more awkward starting point for his perception of his father, the man who put him in such a negative place to start with. So the metaphor through the episode of Cotton's apology being a stand-in for the relationship between the two nations works better with a more cultural context. It then tells a more personal tale, not just of redemption, but in earning that redemption. It wasn't any of Cotton's actions that caused Junichiro to finally decide to leave the past behind, but Hank's, a man who never wronged him in the first place. As he starts to find a common ground between the two men and they exchange lessons on each other's cultures, the two brothers realize that letting the feuds of earlier generations divide them in the modern day doesn't actually help anybody. And this is one of the most recurring themes in King of the Hill, simply extrapolated to an international scale. Cotton and Hank, or Hank and Bobby, rarely get along because of the differences in the way their generations view the world, but it's always by finding something the other party does better, or that both parties do equally well, that this sort of resentment dissipates. The one thing that can heal generational trauma is finding the humanity in the other party and realizing that we're not so different that we need to fight. Season 7. Peggy kidnaps a child, Dale throws pocket sand, Bobby becomes Bill, and Bill becomes Boomhauer. Luanne joins a cult, and Hank becomes an exhibitionist. This is what defines Season 6, and when compared to the first few seasons, it's shocking to see just how dramatically King of the Hill has changed from what it once was. The crazy situations that the show once rejected were now staples of its plots, and the characters start to become more exaggerated versions of themselves to accommodate this new direction. But Mike Judge was unhappy with this change, and when John Altshuler and Dave Krinsky took over, they steered it back towards the small personal story that made the show so original in the first place. But this damage has already been done, assuming one might call it damage. The show has gone to so many crazy places that to drag it down suddenly back to the ground would be jarring, so it was a change that had to be done carefully and believably. But what is King of the Hill known for if not its believability? The tool used to guide the plot structures back to reality is through the characters themselves, who have always stayed relatively normal, even if there are still a few stretch marks left from the excursion. Season 7 is a return to the more simplified plot structures of the early seasons, while keeping the more advanced characterization established by later episodes. As such, it manages to tread new ground without becoming tired or played out, as so many other shows often do when they reach this number of seasons. Get your freak off. Peggy, Nancy, and Min are ranking the guys on their block in order of sexiness when Peggy learns that the others view Hank as being second to last next to Bill. Meanwhile, Hank has found a boy band that he thinks is wholesome after hearing a few of their songs and comparing it to doo-wop. He had just confiscated all of Bobby's records after disapproving of their content. But when he takes Bobby to a concert of theirs alongside his new friend Jordan, he sees Bobby dancing suggestively, taking after the band's members themselves, and he drags Bobby away from the concert. But later he's invited to meet with Jordan's parents about the incident, and they reveal that they don't put restrictions on their children. So Hank tries to show them how to be better role models by taking them out to a Mennonite historical society, where they encounter even cooler parents who announce that they're having a mixed-gender slumber party. Hank forbids Bobby to go, but Peggy lets him sneak out anyway, and once there, Bobby finds out the parents are out, and they're playing 7 Minutes in Heaven. He and Jordan are pushed into the closet together and pressured into fooling around, but Hank breaks up the party and tries to get them to play more wholesome games, which go over well. Later, when picking up the kids, Min and Nancy overhear how Hank saved the day, and change their rating of him to just below John Redcorn. There's a point raised in this episode about kids growing up too fast due to a lack of restrictions made by their parents. Considering how frequently the show points out the many character flaws of Hank that are a result of the overly restrictive mode of thinking, it makes sense for the writers to want to tackle the opposite end of the spectrum as far as parenting goes. It portrays Hank breaking up Bobby's fun as the wrong thing to do early in the episode. Even if it was a bit weird the way he was behaving, Hank should have just straightened him out, not derailed the train altogether. But Jordan's parents, and later Serena's, are shown as an opposite extreme, and them putting the kids into uncomfortable situations is the worst case scenario for the slumber party. But these situations are things that kids go into willingly, at least that's what they tell themselves. In reality, it's a combination of lashing out against the strictness of their own parents and the peer pressure of the other children at the party. Connie, Bobby, and Jordan verbally express how uncomfortable they are with the situation, and it could have escalated into something much more traumatizing for the kids had it not been stopped by Hank. His party games by the end of the episode are corny, but the relief felt by the others in response to knowing they have an out for not growing up so fast is enough to make him the life of the party. The Fat and the Furious. Bill is in a rush at one of Hank's barbecues, and thinking a plate of hot dogs for everyone was for him, scarfs them all down in about a minute. Everybody is disgusted/intrigued, and Hank eventually points out to Bill that eating that quickly is a talent. Later, when disgusting a woman on a date, Bill is scouted by Cindy, a competitive eating enthusiast, and she invites him to a party with all the other big eaters. There, he learns that the best competitive eaters are all skinny Asian guys, and encouraged by patriotism, vows to take home a championship for America. But during the qualifiers, Dale starts denigrating the guy, and showing off how eating is not a talent, eating enough hot dogs that Dale himself qualifies for the competition. But later in the alley, when Bill argues with Dale over his spotlight being stolen, Dale reveals that he once ate bugs for attention in school, only to realize that the other kids were laughing at him, and he's vowed never to eat for spectacle since then. At the finals, Bill gets ahead of the Laotian representative, only to look into the audience and realize that, just as Dale said, the audience doesn't respect him. So he resigns and walks off the stage with his dignity intact. In the B-plot, Peggy tries increasingly desperate things to prevent Bobby from finding out competitive eating exists. Bill has never had any positive thing that separates him from other people. Most of his character traits are negative, with the closest thing he has to a good trait being his abilities to cope with his failure. But for once, Bill is able to find something people admire him for and latches onto the experience. The world of competitive eating is a world that Bill thrives in, and in spite of the dangers to one's body that might result, he's able to accept the physical risks in exchange for the emotional satisfaction. But that's something denied to him as Dale comes close to stealing the spotlight. Once he's back outside of everyone's attention, he's able to be put into a headspace where he can look at it with more skepticism, just in time for Dale to inform him that being the center of attention isn't always a positive thing. Through all of the talk of nationalism and doing it for your country, nobody ever stops to ask Bill if he's doing it for himself. And once he realizes that it's better to be ignored than laughed at, he's able to start respecting himself just a little bit more. Bad girls, what you gonna do? Bobby asks Connie to be his partner for the upcoming science fair, but after meeting her cousin, Teed Pow, he develops a crush which combines with feelings that he might be leading Connie on. Teed Pow, as Connie explains, is her delinquent cousin from LA, who was sent to Ireland for poor grades, though a conversation she has on her phone reveals the real reason. She's laying low after stealing drugs from a gang. She's hoping to pay back the gang she stole from so that she can return home, and plots to trick someone into helping her with the supply, when Bobby volunteers to be her science fair partner. Teed Pow starts to seduce Bobby into gathering supplies for her meth lab, convincing him to steal propane from Strickland and encouraging him to tag the alley. Eventually, Bobby becomes anxious that he's not cool enough for her and transports the lab to his school, setting up the equipment in front of an officer. When Connie realizes what's going on, she destroys the meth lab with a potato cannon to save Bobby from jail time, and Teed Pow gets sent to rural Wisconsin with a different uncle. Last season, we saw that Connie and Bobby's relationship was predicated on the fact that there was a sense of rebellion to their togetherness, and when the relationship was finally approved of by Con, they broke up. As Bobby does not find a normal, boring girl to be interesting, he moves from Connie to Teed Pow, someone much more openly rebellious. This is in stark contrast to the straight-laced relationship of Hank and Peggy, two people that Bobby has always clashed with emotionally and has always tried to reject in terms of lifestyle. And so just like with so many episodes before, Bobby tries to do the opposite of what Hank would do in the situation, only for this to backfire while things spiral out of control. It's the normal, boring girl Connie who's able to bail him out of the situation, when ordinarily it would have been the straight-laced Hank to do so. Thematically, it's a similar plot, but as the characters involved have grown, we get to see their roles expanded to better fit the direction of the show. Now, Connie is such an ingrained member of the cast, she's able to adopt archetypes that were once reserved for Hank and all he stood for. Goodbye, normal jeans. Hank is appalled that Bobby is taking home economics, cleaning stains out of outfits, and cooking. But when Bobby starts to fret over an assignment, He gets a motivating speech from Peggy, and then the two destroy Hank's favorite pair of jeans. He starts to pay more attention in class and manages to rebuild Hank's pants, and Hank loves the new clothes and the food Bobby starts to make, enough that he begins to believe that he's one-upping Peggy's meals, and spoiling Hank in a way that Peggy has never been able to do so. So Peggy goes to her hairdresser Ernst and vents about Bobby upstaging her in this way, to which he replies that Bobby cannot take her place in the bedroom. So she gets her hair done up, only for the fumes from the product to make Hank feel sick, and Peggy leaves when she sees him separating their beds. As Bobby is still awake, Peggy uses his bed, and Bobby sleeps in the master bedroom with Hank, staying up all night as the two talk. So she tries to sabotage Bobby's new lifestyle, at first by revealing that he has a homemaking magazine under his bed, and then by stealing the Thanksgiving turkey he made. But when she takes the bird to her hairdressers and finds out that even he has a loving family, Peggy breaks down and Hank has to take matters into his own hands. Eventually, Peggy gets home and finds that Hank has cooked all of the meals Peggy usually makes, informing her that he didn't marry her for the homemaking skills, but because of, the love. Hank is portrayed as a very traditional type of conservative man socially, and yet whenever he's confronted with some sort of change, there's always a chance for him to learn to accept and even embrace it. Bobby starts to behave like a housewife during this episode, something Hank is against out of principle, until he starts to see the usefulness of the skill set. Hank begins to consider the work Bobby is doing is barely different from his own around the house. And of course, the reason he would think this way in the first place is that he's already accepted one non-traditional family member. Peggy is not the traditional housewife that's lauded as an ideal for so many old-timers. Her cooking is subpar, she forgets to clean, and she always speaks her mind. She's very driven when it comes to her career as well. Hank did not marry her because she was traditional, even if that's why he does everything else in life. He married her for her personality. Peggy's opinions are among the few that he regularly respects and even seeks out on occasion. So when Peggy laments that Bobby is challenging her role as the woman of the house, it's a fear born out of not knowing the value she really contributes. Dances with dogs. Hank catches Bobby dancing with Ladybird in secret and admonishes the boy for the weird behavior. But later on in the garage, Ladybird hears a song on the radio that she enjoys and insists on dancing with Hank, which he finds out that he enjoys as well. The other guys in the alley make fun of him for it, except for Bill, who immediately rushes out to get a dog of his own to be a dance partner. As Hank is busy dancing with Ladybird, Bobby arranges to dance with Connie's dog, Doggy. The two enter the same off-leash freestyle competition and begin to practice with secrecy, feuding and fearing that the other one might steal their moves. Peggy is upset about being in the middle of their spat, and so Hank takes her out dancing only to grill her for information about Bobby's routine, causing her to throw in with her son, instead of staying neutral. Bill, meanwhile, has adopted a Rottweiler that he's struggling to control, the animal attacking him as soon as he takes off the muzzle, where he's barely able to get it back on before being cornered in the shower. The three couples arrive at the competition and show off their moves, with Hank being confident in his fundamentals to woo the judges. But they go for Bobby's flashier performance, which gets second, and Hank doesn't place at all. In the end, he tries to put up the costume, though Ladybird still insists on dancing, and soon the rest of the family joins in. Structurally, this is about as typical a King of the Hill episode as you can get for the first two-thirds. Hank finds Bobby doing something he disapproves of, then comes around to the idea, then gets too far into it. And usually the end result would have some character learn a valuable lesson about limits or tradition, and they'd all go back to the way things were. But if that doesn't happen, then the episode ends largely the same. Hank gets extremely into doggy dancing and competes against Bobby. Their rivalry is the highlight of the episode and is constantly put into contrast with the rest of the alley's responses. Dale and Boomhauer find it laughable, only to spend the rest of the episode standing around doing nothing. Con finds it stupid, but he finds Bobby stupid too and enjoys the matchup. And Peggy thinks it's pointless and beneath her until Hank accidentally calls her by his dog's name and she's motivated to start rooting against him. Especially coming off of the last two seasons, having a plot about the most mundane imaginable sporting event and having each character get extremely into it is a sure sign of the show's change of pace. The sun also roses. Hank tries to train Bobby for football tryouts, but as he's too portly for any position, Bobby becomes the towel manager instead. But this job isn't what it's cracked up to be, and despite Hank's approval, Bobby ends up leaving the team. noticing Mrs. Supernussenphone's rose garden in the alley and asking about the plants. He then gets into rose growing, getting the supplies he needs as well as some Eastern philosophy from a local gardening shop, Stems and Seeds. He misses the game and Hank yells at him for this, getting even more upset that Bobby doesn't seem to care about competition to grow roses instead. But Peggy gives Hank the idea to enter Bobby in a rose-growing competition, something they can do together, and Hank learns just how competitive the world of rose-growing can be. He gets them a sponsorship from Stems and Seeds and begins to take over the duties of Bobby, ignoring his advice on philosophy to follow the American Rose Association's guidebook to the letter. On the day of the competition, Bobby gets boxed out of contributing, only for him to accidentally knock over the vase, bruising the petals. This hurts their score and the Stems and Seeds team loses, but despite the loss, Hank decides to let Bobby grow his flowers in the front yard in the future. Hank Hill loves the tradition of competition, using it as a means of judging the quality of a person relative to their peers. It's the idea of trying your best to fit in so much that you can stand out that drives so many of his life decisions. Hank wants Bobby to take after him and be the best at something, the spirit of competition driving the respect others give to him. Because for Hank, happiness is something to be won, your neighbors and peers being conquered in order to force them to acknowledge your worth, and then to derive your self-worth from the praise that others give you. But Bobby already has self-respect. He's happy, and this happiness is derived internally. So to compete with others to try to prove you're worthy of their respect, and thus your own, is pointless to him, as the end result does not make Bobby any better off, while the potential downside of trying your best at something only to be told you're not good enough can only hurt his ego. Especially something with defined win conditions and rule sets like a competition. Bobby's rose would have had points counted off for its uniqueness, that the things that make it special also make it worse, going against Hank's idea of conformity and competition that Bobby didn't partake in from the beginning. The Texas Skillsaw Massacre. Hank falls through a hole in the floor of his kitchen when he finds out that Dale dug one beneath his house. To punish him, he does not allow Dale to use his new skill saw that he purchased for the repairs. But while the repairs are ongoing, per a city inspection, Hank cannot stay inside the domicile. So Nancy guilts Dale into volunteering his house for the Hill family until it's safe to stay in again. But Dale drives Hank mad with his habit, and later, while cutting a board, Dale's finger is cut off by the saw. Dale decides to press charges, and when Hank has an outburst in the courtroom, he's ordered to take anger management courses to get a restraining order removed. While at his classes, he meets another angry man, Big Jim, who bonds with Hank over how much they hate the course. Big Jim and Hank work together to repair the tunnel while Dale taunts them, only for Big Jim to lash out at Dale so hard he has a stroke, dying on the spot. At the funeral, Hank realizes that he may actually have anger issues, and he starts to take the class seriously enough to graduate. Post-graduation, he's back at the alley where he learns the guys have dug underneath the street. But when a garbage truck threatens to collapse the tunnel and he can't convince his friends to leave it, Hank gets angry and threatens them out, saving their lives. Hank's anger is a small part of his character relative to many other traits of his, but it's exaggerated here in order for the trait to be tested for the plot. People start to treat him differently, even his own wife, as they begin to think that he's got issues with controlling his temper, which, despite being true, is usually something that happens in response to a frustrating issue. But anger isn't necessarily a pointless emotion. Big Jim raises the point that people who don't get mad wind up being the world's doormats, and Hank is not the type of person to let other people boss him around without purpose. Ultimately, Hank ends up learning that anger without reason is negative, while righteous anger is fine, even useful. If being angry can stop someone from hurting themselves and others, then it's okay to lash out in order to get an immediate reaction. But using anger as a default is when the emotion becomes an issue. So the end of the episode has Hank first tried to use logic to appeal to his friends, with the threats only coming about when it's clear they have no intention of listening to reason. And that is the message of this episode. Full Metal Dust Jacket. Tired of the lack of intellectual stimulation in the world of teaching, Peggy goes to a local bookstore and learns about a book club hosted regularly. When she tries to get into it, she learns that the store owner who told her about it was only in because she gave the patrons a discount on novels in exchange. So Peggy buys the bookstore. But business is slow to non-existent, and when Dale comes in hoping to find a book big enough to hide a gun inside, another patron thinks the guns are for sale, and soon, in order to keep paying the lease, Peggy agrees to let Dale sell firearms in her store so long as she gets a cut of each transaction. In order to keep the business legal, the guns are technically not sold but are given as gifts with the purchase of a book, but this only means that she's giving away books to Dale's patrons. She eventually gets her invite to the book club, with Hank being dragged along as it's a couples book club, only for the other members to be less interested in reading and more interested in casual conversation. They uninvite Peggy from future meetings and she laments the loss of her potential new friends, ultimately selling her book and gun store after kicking Dale out. Yet in the end, the gun enthusiasts who were receiving the books come back, as they actually developed an interest in reading, and soon, Peggy hosts a book club with a different type of clientele at the Hill residence. Peggy views reading as an intellectual pursuit, reserved for the literati and upper crust of polite society. But every demographic or individual in this episode ends up having a different take on this perception, showing just how universal reading and stories can be that even genre bounds get mixed. Bobby finds enjoyment in a high fantasy novel despite the disapproval of Hank, something expected by this point in the show. But going along with this is the way every other group starts to read. While Dale's gun club is at first shown to use the books for little more than target practice, they do eventually read through them, and despite not having normal takes on the themes and character dynamics, their genuine love of literature is enough that perhaps a normal take isn't what one should be reading for in the first place. Peggy tries to join a book club, and that club ends up being more of a social circle than actual literature enthusiasts. The gun club ends up being more appreciative of the themes in a womanly title, and even Hank finds himself enthralled in the book Peggy makes him read. With each group contributing something new to the conversation, it leaves the original book club out of the discussion, inverting the expected outcome of this episode as Peggy too winds up with a different take on what kind of company she wanted to keep at the start. Pigmalion. Peggy forces Luanne to quit a job when she overhears the business's owner yelling at her and tries to have the girl find a new career, taking an entrepreneurship class at the Learning Annex. Luanne is unsure about this, wishing that she could make the decision for herself, but during the class she meets a man named Trip Larson, the owner of a pork products empire, who immediately falls for her. Trip invites Luanne back to his mansion and the two begin dating. Peggy and Hank disapprove at first, and although Hank is won over by football bloopers, Peggy is not swayed and she gets into an argument with Luanne, who stays with Trip after that point. But Trip starts to become more and more controlling, telling Luanne what to wear and dyeing her hair, eventually causing her to wind up like the woman on an advertisement that Trip had near his crib as a baby. At a Halloween party he throws later, Trip is dressed as a pig and reveals his true plan, having Luanne marry a man dressed in Bavarian garb so he can recreate the ad perfectly, with Trip as the pig. Luanne flees from the man and is chased into the slaughterhouse, where he wrestles with her onto the killing floor, deciding that if they can't be a family, then the two can become pork products together instead. But after an electric shock, Trip snaps out of his insanity, just in time to be slaughtered and turned into a sausage. This episode was held back for 2 seasons, originally meant to be aired as a part of Season 5, but being pushed back to air closer to the Halloween holiday. It was then pulled from airing due to the graphic content depicted, which is fitting as it was originally meant to be a Halloween episode. The whole episode is framed as a horror story, starting innocuous enough as the theme of Luanne wanting independence is set up, only for Trip to reveal his true plan, and that independence to be stripped away as she loses her free will. It culminates in a chase into a slaughterhouse, with the same techniques used as many slasher film finales, and concludes with a big shocking moment. Luanne ultimately doesn't really get the independence she wanted by the end of the episode, a tongue-in-cheek exchange between her and Peggy, having the girl repeat everything her aunt says, as she's declaring that she can think for herself. Through the script, she's constantly trying to differentiate the idea that she's stupid and the idea that she's ignorant. Ignorance being when you make mistakes due to not knowing any better, and stupidity being when you make mistakes despite knowing better. Luanne has had many failed relationships in the past, so one more bad boyfriend may have made her come across as stupid, though given the unhinged and unpredictable nature of Trip Larson, maybe she gets a pass as ignorant for this one. Megalo Dale. Hank finds out about a rat infestation at the Megalo Mart while making a propane run there. He's hesitant to put his name on the line by recommending Dale for the extermination, but does it anyway. Dale immediately gets to setting traps and hunting the rat, but comes up with no leads, until he notices chewed up security wires and deduces that it's not a rat he's hunting. Using the cover story of now searching for a baboon, he asks a few of the store employees what they've seen, only to get made fun of by some teenagers. Afterwards, Dale decides he's hunting for Chuck Mangione, and calls Hank to inform him of this. Thinking Dale has lost his mind, Hank, Bill, and Boomhauer dress in dead bug uniforms to flush out the real rat and take Dale home, but when he finds out the reason they're there, Dale starts to feel like his friends no longer trust him. But something really is in the store, blocking them in and setting up traps to counter Dale's, eventually revealing themselves as the two teens from before. They corner Dale in an aisle only for the real Chuck Mangione to save him. The musician reveals that he's contracted to perform at every single Megalomart opening, over 400 a year, and has been hiding out inside the store to weasel out of the obligation. With some advice from Chuck, Dale's able to outwit the teens from before, and they're arrested, with the pest problem finally being taken care of, or so everybody believes. For once, Dale deduces a conspiracy theory that turns out to be completely correct, but as usual, no one believes him. As he now has proof of his beliefs, this lack of faith in his words stands out much more than before, proof that his friends have never really respected him, as their skepticism turns out to be real disrespect. And when Hank leads the others in trying to do Dale's job for him, he realizes that Hank values his own reputation far more than Dale's self-image. And yet by the end of this episode, Dale ends up not being able to prove himself right, finding Chuck Mangione hiding in the store and refusing to rat him out due to his personal code of honor. Chuck is sticking it to the man, and Dale respects that too much to interrupt. But this works out for him, as even though his friends still think he's crazy for hallucinating Chuck Mangione, Dale knows that he was right, and so his self-image manages to be preserved as he can believe himself, even when no one else does. Boxing Luanne. Tired of being ogled and disrespected by the men in her class, Luanne practices at Tai Bo to work off the stress and feel empowered. But while Buck Strickland and his brother, a woman's boxing promoter, are at the gym checking out the girls, he pretends like he was planning on having Luanne fight to cover for why he's there. She boxes against her first opponent and wins, to the surprise of Hank, who had forbidden the fight. Though it's soon revealed that Buck Strickland has simply been finding patsies to throw fights against Luanne, and the only reason she was led into the ring in the first place was because he wanted her to bounce around for the men in the audience. When Luanne and Peggy believe that she's ready to fight Frida Foreman, George Foreman's daughter, they manage to arrange a time and place, only for Hank to learn that the fights were thrown and that Luanne is not a real boxer. In spite of his attempts to get George Foreman to call off the fight, which fall through when Hank insults his grills, Luanne decides to go through with it anyway, instead of simply taking a dive to impress the fans and get a paycheck. And after taking several real punches, she soon earns the respect of the men who came to see her box. Luanne believes that her new boxing career will earn her the respect of the men who have come to see her, while she's unaware of the real reason they're there. But despite this not being the case, she had still managed to find a level of self-respect for the duration that she had legitimately believed in herself. While Luanne was under the impression that she was a real boxer, she was equally assuming that she was being respected by the people around her, and that was enough to repair her self-esteem. But upon learning that she was not a real boxer, that self-image is shattered. But she really only loses her self-respect when she learns it was all a show, so the best way to earn it back is to prove that it never was, or at least that it never needed to be. If she can go a few rounds against a real professional, then it proves that she'd had it in her all along, and that none of her opponents ever needed to throw. Of course, at first this would not have been the case. Early in her boxing career, Luanne never could have won any legitimate fights. It was only with the newfound confidence that she ever became able to think she could. And that vision became a reality not through winning, but simply by standing her ground. Vision Quest. John Redcorn is afraid for Joseph's future, being raised by another man and falling in with a bad crowd instead of with Bobby. He wants his son to undergo a vision quest, something brought on by starvation and exhaustion, and for him to interpret it to straighten the boy out. So Hank takes Bobby, Dale, and Joseph camping to have this quest, believing that it would be suspicious if John Redcorn goes too. But the only person to pass out and see anything is Dale, who interprets a dream about an Indian American baby as a sign that he himself is Indian. Dale starts to play up his imagined heritage, embarrassing Joseph, who wants to befriend some cooler kids by spray painting pandas at the zoo. But when he has a vision about a herd of buffalo trampling him near a panda, Dale interprets it to mean that he should kill and skin a panda before the other cool kids get there. But Bobby tells on his friend and John Redcorn rushes out to stop him, catching up just as the others arrive, where Joseph is forced to decide whether to kill the panda or go his own way, and he ends up choosing the latter option so he can be a leader himself. Many of the characters in King of the Hill are flawed people, and flawed in such a way as to not recognize their own shortcomings or to believe that they're positive traits. Dale wants his son to be one of the cool kids, a way of living vicariously through the boy to experience a life he never got to have. Joseph is at an impressionable age and willing to go along with whatever his dad thinks is right, but John Redcorn knows better than Dale and does not want his son to have the same life that he did. John Redcorn being a former cool kid who grew out of that drifter lifestyle. And yet John Redcorn's motivations for influencing his son to be better aren't out of a selfless desire, but out of a want to see his son become more like him. One side wants Joseph to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, and another wants him to do the wrong thing for the right reasons. Ultimately, the only person who can decide the future for Joseph is Joseph himself. To simply let others guide him and pressure him into behaving more like them is to be a follower for the rest of his life. Even going along blindly with one of his parental figures means he'll be stuck in the same way of thinking, with one exception. Bobby narks on his friend out of a desire to protect him, a decidedly uncool thing, and yet this is the right action done for the right reason, so Joseph still has at least one purely good influence in his life. Queasy Rider. Hank and Peggy are having arguments about Hank always making decisions without consulting his wife after he tries to take her to Houston to watch a football team's training camp. So at Dale's recommendation, they see a couples therapist. They tell the therapist about their retirement dream, to buy 2 motorcycles and travel the country. But as they're halfway to being able to purchase the bikes, the therapist suggests that they simply get the one and drive it together. This works to repair their marriage for a while as they start to spend their time with the motorcycle and one another, until they see a happily married biker couple at a store and get an invitation to Sturgis for a rally. Hank and Peggy leave Bobby with Cotton and head out together, but Peggy does not get to drive any of the way there, and Hank finds it unmanly to sit behind a woman. They feud for the last stretch of the trip as Peggy ultimately decides to take a bus home so she doesn't have to share a ride with Hank. But Hank's glasses break when he's bumped into, and when trying to repair them, he sees other biker couples talking about women knowing their place. He's put off by how misogynistic the culture around cycling can be and returns to Peggy, with the two driving home together, this time Peggy in the driver's seat. Hank Hill is an old-fashioned kind of guy, and one key tenet of so many conservative and old-fashioned ideologies is women having a lesser place in society than men. So while Hank does love his wife, he also follows a moral code that doesn't give her the amount of respect she deserves, and he does this without consciously realizing it. It's not until the couple's therapy that he gets any opinions to the contrary, and even then it takes seeing a more extreme example of this sort of behavior that really makes him understand that the way he's been treating Peggy is subpar. And so, with these two clashing ideals, Hank is forced to choose between the culture he was raised in and the culture he's married into. That is, to be married to a woman who rejects the second-class place that many would want her to be in. And while Hank at first chooses tradition, as it's the thing that's gotten him to where he is, he ultimately chooses to reject a part of his old-fashioned ideals to get him to where he wants to go. It's not as though being conservative is a bad thing, as long as the ideals are compartmentalized and you take the good while leaving the bad. Board games. After seeing Bobby and Joseph messing around in a parking lot after school and learning that their programs they used to attend to have been cut, Peggy, Min, and Nancy decide to run a candidate for the school board. They know they have an advantage as Peggy can use her sway as a substitute, Min can win over the Laotian vote, and Nancy's popular with the news watchers. But they disagree as to which one of them will be the actual candidate, and Min volunteers before anyone else gets the chance. But Peggy tries to control her campaign on her own, only to clash with the others, resulting in Min declaring that people with 2-year degrees should not be eligible to teach classes, meaning Peggy would lose her substitute teaching job. So Peggy decides to coordinate with Nancy to betray Min, only for Nancy to announce on television that she's running for school board herself. Disgruntled, Peggy resorts to a last-minute plan to pretend to be the voting bus and shuttles all of the other women's supporters out of the state for the day of the election. In the end, none of them win, and the three decide that they should simply watch the kids on their own. Although they all start out with good intentions, retaining the after-school programs that the children need for enrichment, by the end of the episode, none of the three Rainy Street women running for the board actually care about the real position. Nancy runs on the idea that Min is unfit to run. Min uses rhetoric about togetherness instead of suggesting much in the way of the original policies, and Peggy just wants to see the others fail. The politicking of the candidates gets in the way of the actual issues, and thus in the way of actual progress. And this is to say nothing of the interpersonal relationships of the cast. Peggy, Nancy, and Min are close friends at the beginning and end of the episode, their relationships decaying only during the election, as they care more about themselves and their platforms than what it was they originally set out to do. It speaks to the art of compromise, something central to any diplomacy, and how it could have prevented any further issues. Even at the start of their campaign, Peggy and Min were willing to give each other friendly advice, as they knew it would help their overall message. An Officer and a Gentle Boy. Hank is trying to teach Bobby some discipline, but can't get through to his son, so Cotton suggests taking him to Fort Burke, the military academy that straightened him out as a child, so he can undergo a 2-week boot camp. Hank and Peggy are worried about how the boy will turn out, having heard the horror stories from Cotton, and after a few days they show up for a wellness check. But once there, they find that the academy is rather nice, teaching crafts and giving the cadets proper food. Eventually, Cotton discovers this and shows up at the camp himself to take over, bringing the standards back to what they were during his time. He singles Bobby out, giving him the harshest punishments to no success, eventually putting the boy into the hole, a concrete box used as a punishment. When making a delivery to Deity, Hank learns that Cotton is at Fort Burke and that he's put Bobby into the hole, rushing over there to save his son. Hank arrives just as Cotton is about to let him out, only to see that Bobby is unaffected. In the end, it's revealed that he saw graffiti left by Cotton during his time, stating that he'd spent 2 days in the hole, while Bobby spent 3. As Hank Hill repeatedly says when referring to Bobby, that boy ain't right. And yet during this episode, when put up against the same challenges that Cotton admits were too much for him, Bobby is able to succeed unharmed. There's a large amount of importance made regarding how combat-ready boys are as a gauge of their quality, a holdover from Cold War paranoia that defined earlier generations of American men. And yet, despite Bobby clearly not being a fighter, he's still able to hold up to these completely arbitrary standards. In part, this is due to Bobby's lack of ego. So many military exercises are designed to spiritually break down recruits, to cause some sort of ego death so they can be built up into something else. But all of the struggle here is dependent on the amount of ego that the subject has. If they're proud, then they'll feel humiliated until they feel nothing. Yet for Bobby, that feeling of humiliation is absent. To quote a great man, pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. And Bobby, however unintentionally, has figured this out as he seeks out attention not from his pride, but adaptability. The Miseducation of Bobby Hill. Hank takes Bobby to the Grill Stravaganza, hoping to teach his son the basics of salesmanship. He starts Bobby out by wiping tanks and calibrating gauges, but Bobby just wants to sell grills on the floor. When the boy sees Joe Jack using tricks to sell grills while Hank is simply giving customers pamphlets and leading them out the door, Bobby starts to take after Joe Jack's flashier style, and he begins to make a sale himself. Hank is appalled by this behavior as it ignores the fundamentals, but Buck Strickland sees the potential in the boy and adds him to the sales team, with Bobby overtaking Hank in sales. So Hank, hoping to prove his methods to the boy, starts to try to mimic his tactics to so little success that Buck bets Hank in a poker game and loses. But things take a turn when Hank is wiping tanks at Thatherton's when the customers Bobby sold to come back demanding refunds as Bobby never properly informed them about the grills. Hank is brought back to mitigate the disaster and manages to turn each customer into a satisfied one. Just before closing, one of the customers Hank gave a pamphlet to comes back and declares he's transitioning his trailer park to propane, giving Hank the sales edge to win at the last minute. Meanwhile, Dale, Bill, and Boomhauer strap a bunch of weather balloons to a lawn chair in the hopes of flying, only for Bill to lose control and fly away. Bobby and Joe Jack's method of salesmanship is all style with no substance, the kind of thing that works up front, but after a few weeks of practice reveals its issues. Bobby knows nothing about grills and ends up selling the wrong product to the wrong customer repeatedly. And while this is good for short-term gains, it shows more and more weakness as the grill stravaganza goes on. Because while it's easy to rip people off with a lie, these lies only last for so long. It shows the issues with the system where salesmen are incentivized to hit arbitrarily high marks regardless of how these sales are made, much in the same way that success is often measured in ways that only show a surface-level interpretation of events. Hank doesn't really care about his sales figures, he cares about the overall satisfaction of his customer base, much in the same way that he's never been motivated by money but security, or how he cares less about showing off his wealth than keeping it. So Buck Strickland's system of monitoring and rewarding sales ends up showing its faults as all of the success is front-loaded with no backup plan of what to do when people find out that they've been ripped off. The Good Buck. Buck Strickland comes into work broken up over his wife leaving him and the fact that he's gambled away part of the Strickland empire. So Hank, remembering that Buck was the one to get him into propane in the first place, decides to help the guy straighten his life out by taking him to church. There he meets Luanne, who's been upset that her Bible study class won't accept her as a temporary substitute, and she begins to privately teach the guy about Jesus. Hank and Peggy are skeptical of Buck's intentions, assuming he just wants to sleep with Luanne, made worse when he begins to request that they study the Bible in her pool. These Bible studies become larger and larger, with more people joining in, all of whom are just there to look at Luanne in her swimsuit. But after Buck makes an impassioned speech comparing himself to the prodigal son, Hank and Peggy come around to the idea that he truly has been saved. And then Buck announces his intentions to marry Luanne. But Luanne shoots this suggestion down and Buck breaks down again, coming into the office drunk and passing out. When he wakes up, he sees Hank polishing propane tanks and joins in, vowing to make propane his only vice in the future. In the B-plot, Bobby skips his cross-country practice to dine in a hotel's diner, befriending two elderly women in the process. Buck Strickland has always been one of the least moral characters of the show, constantly involved in gambling, drinking, and other miscellaneous dives and vices. And no matter what happens to him through the show, he always manages to return to the way he started out at the beginning of the episode. Here, the episode gets a positive ending, with Buck vowing the same dedication to propane that Hank has, but the audience is fully aware that he's doomed to the same spiral of depression and desperation that he's always had in him. Or is he? Because this episode also makes a point that Buck Strickland was once a much better person. He noticed the work ethic of Hank Hill and hired the man on the spot due to his principles rather than abilities. He also taught Hank Hill everything he knows, and with Hank's personality, it's clear that this includes a large part of the guy's current philosophy. So instead of a miserable wreck, his downward spiral becomes a facet of a tragic character. Buck Strickland was not always this way, but he's doomed to continue down on the path no matter what temporary goodness he exhibits. This is why Hank and Peggy are so confused about his proposal to Luanne. While they know that his expression of religion is likely genuine, they're also fully aware that it's temporary, and he'll soon be back to the gambling booze hound he used to be. I Never Promised You an Organic Garden. Looking for a job at the school, Peggy finds out about a cut organic gardening class that students have been able to opt into as a gym alternative. She talks her way into teaching the class on the condition that the food be used to feed the football team. The first harvest is a success, and the coaches, plus Hank, are so impressed by the food that their praise encourages the organic gardening class to keep at it. But the next harvest is full of bugs and other pests, so Peggy tries to look up meaningful ways to prevent the pests from gathering, but nothing works. When she goes to the old organic teacher, he advises her to simply use pesticides and not tell anybody. This works, and the garden is brought back to its bountiful self, with Hank so proud of the hard work of all the students that he starts to refer to them as a team, and makes jerseys. But later on, the truth is discovered when Peggy is caught with a pesticide, and the team becomes demotivated with the class being cut once more. But Bobby refuses to allow his hard work to go to waste, and begins one final harvest before the area gets used by the football team for storage, motivating everyone else to come back to work too. The purpose of the organic garden as a means of providing food is something that's viewed as the only thing any of the effort is good for, though this is far from the truth, even to characters who are motivated otherwise. Hank is appalled when he learns that Peggy has been cheating with pesticides, and yet the only reason he was involved with the gardening program in the first place was because he saw the team effort it took to maintain the garden, as well as the leadership Bobby was showing, and compared it to the efforts of a football team. It was never about following arbitrary rules, but teaching a sense of work ethic and discipline to the participants. And if you think about it, football is more or less the same thing. Nobody really cares who's the best at moving the ball from one place to another. The skill set from the sport of football is barely applicable to the real world, and yet the efforts to improve at the sport, work with the team, and the friendships you form in the locker room are all things that will continue to be useful for your whole life. So even if the spirit of the organic garden was violated with the use of chemicals, the concepts that had the real value remained intact, and that matters more than how big your tomatoes are. Be true to your fool. Hoping to get a chance with the girl who treats lice at the school, Bill infests the alley with head lice. They all attempt to remove the lice, with Hank, Dale, and Boomhauer ultimately shaving their heads to stop the itching. But when they do so, Hank discovers that he has a tattoo of Bill's name on the back of his skull. Bill, meanwhile, has been excommunicated by the alley, so he resorts to drinking alone when he gets arrested for public intoxication. Hank gets the tattoo removed, and then asks Boomhauer where he got the tattoo to learn the story. That he and the guys had gone out drinking to celebrate Bill's deployment, where a drunken Hank taunted some bikers and got saved from an assault by Bill, Hank getting a Bill tattoo to commend the action. He feels bad about not bailing the guy out of jail, and goes down to the station to apologize to his friend, but Bill has found acceptance among the other inmates and refuses to leave. So Hank gets himself arrested so he can speak with his friend, though when Bill stops talking to him after learning the full story of the tattoo, Hank asks another inmate to give him a new Bill tattoo in the same spot, and the two finally make their peace. While Bill is a loser in the present day, this episode's flashbacks show that he was not always this way. Once upon a time, he was the type of person that even Hank respected, as well as being the kind of person to deserve that respect. So Hank's tattoo that he discovers is a memory of the time where his friend wasn't so much of a failure. And many of his present failings are, in part, the result of the people closest to him abandoning the guy. Bill went downhill after he lost Lenore, and it's implied several times through the show that if Hank weren't around, Bill would be much worse off. So to turn his back on his friend means that Hank will, in a small way, contribute to Bill becoming even worse off than before. Without the guys from the alley around, Bill considers confessing to a string of break-ins and misdemeanors so he can hang out with criminals who look up to him. He would have gone from a loser to a menace to society, were it not for Hank expressing some small desire that he remain the way he is. For Hank to give up on Bill means an even lower chance that he ever turns his life around, as if declaring that such a thing is no longer possible. Racist Dog. When the Hill family's water heater starts leaking, Peggy invites Mac, a repairman from the church, over to fix it, not trusting Hank to do the job as he was the one who installed the malfunctioning one. But when Lady Bird comes into the closet to see what's going on, she attacks Mac, and the repairman accuses the dog of being racist. Hank tries to insist that Lady Bird is not prejudiced, but when taking her to a canine training school, the instructor says that Lady Bird picked up on Hank's subconscious signals and that she wasn't the racist one, but Hank was. The rest of the church hears about Hank's prejudiced ways and starts to shun him, made worse when Lady Bird attacks a rehabilitation doll he was using in front of the congregation. Eventually, another repairman is called over to look at the water heater, and Lady Bird attacks him too, despite the guy being white. At this, Hank concludes that Lady Bird does not hate black people, but repairmen. She was picking up on Hank's dislike of other men working on his hardware. Hank puts a lot of care into the relationship he has with Lady Bird, so finding out that he's raised her to be potentially prejudiced reflects badly on him. But it's not as though this was something consciously done by the guy, as Hank himself has never shown any particular inclination to dislike anybody for a demographic reason, unless they're from Oklahoma. And yet the rest of the church is willing to go along with this idea of Hank being racist in spite of his own words otherwise, as a lot of prejudice is done subconsciously. Whether it's as simple as seeing an Asian man and assuming he's either Chinese or Japanese, or even overcompensating in the other direction, by trying to play up his niceness around an African American man as though he has something to prove. At the end of the episode, it's shown that Hank is not racist, but that he hates repairmen, his nervousness around them making Lady Bird react negatively. And so this ends up also explaining why he got a poor score on the racist test, and the reason that Lady Bird attacked the doll that he and Bobby were interacting with. The situations made him uncomfortable, as he tried too hard to overcompensate for his behavior, forcing himself to behave in an unnatural way. Hank considers himself an American, and deeply believes in all of the ideals the country espouses, down to individual freedoms and not judging people. But when the topic of racial prejudice is brought up again and again, he suddenly starts to see race again, as it's at the forefront of the conversation. Night and Deity. When Bill causes a pigeon infestation in the alley, Dale tries to solve the issue but fails, so he calls in a pigeon expert, Sheila Refkin. Sheila has a keen interest in extermination, and is able to talk shop with Dale, who's excited to have someone as interested in extermination as he is. But this attention garners the jealousy of Nancy, who starts to fret that her husband is spending time around another woman, while she and Dale have next to nothing in common. Eventually, Sheila invites Dale to an overnight extermination at the Econo Suites, something that Nancy compares to her migraine workshops with John Redcorn, and she stays up all night fretting over it with Peggy. Peggy, meanwhile, has been jealous of Hank for being selected as the designated driver for Luanne's 21st birthday party, but Hank gets roped into chugging some alcohol and, unable to drive the girls home, Luanne gets a ride with a man who is hitting on her while Hank watches them make out from the back seat. Boomhauer and Bill find a pigeon under the influence of one of Sheila's pigeon repellents, and they babysit it for the night so it can come down off its high. In the end, Dale finds out that Sheila had intended to seduce him on the overnight trip, and he rejects her as he reprofesses his love for Nancy. After years of Nancy cheating on Dale, the situation is nearly reversed during this episode, Dale finding a woman who loves him the same way that she once loved John Redcorn. And while there would be some sort of karmic justice to Nancy losing her husband to another woman, karma doesn't necessarily mean the best for everybody. Especially in a familial relationship, infidelity of this kind can lead to problems for friends, and especially for Joseph, although this is an angle not explored during the episode. Instead, the spotlight is put onto the relationship between Nancy and Dale, specifically that it's one not built on a mutual interest but much deeper personal connections. In the earlier seasons, it would have been easy to imagine Nancy not caring if Dale had run off with another woman. It would have given her more time with John Redcorn after all. But by now she's trying to remain faithful to her husband, and despite a few underhanded tactics being deployed, like trying to set up Sheila with her former masseuse. It raises the question of whether or not Nancy really deserves a second chance with Dale, as well as the idea that potentially two wrongs not making a right, even if Dale is unaware of one of these wrongs. So Dale ends up passing a test of character that he was unaware of, and as a reward, gets to keep the good parts of his life intact. Maid in Arlen. Khan's mother, Leoma, moves in with the Sufenusentphone family, and immediately starts to get on Min's nerves as she corrects the other woman's housework. But after Leoma goes to the Hill family and starts to work cheaply just to get out of the house, Min gets the idea to have her clean the houses of the rest of Rainy Street to get some time alone. But as she's taking care of Bill, the two start to flirt over their mutual loneliness, and soon start to date. Khan is mortified by this and struggles to adapt to the change in his life as he finds Bill repulsive. So he sabotages the relationship by telling Bill that he ought to break up with Leoma, as she's dating an astronaut and doesn't have the heart to break up with him herself. Afterwards, Bill becomes even more miserable than usual, and Leoma declares that she's moving to a retirement community to be away from him. But before she can leave, Hank gives Bill a motivating speech to declare his feelings one last time, and as he does so, everybody discovers Khan's lie. In the end, the couple makes up, with Khan begrudgingly coming around in the relationship. Due to a combination of loneliness and a feeling like she may be abusing the hospitality of a younger relative, Leoma finds solace in cleaning and cooking for someone else, her personality being one where she's only happy by making others happy. And Bill is by far the one person on Rainy Street who needs this relationship the most, barely able to take care of himself at the best. He starts to see an improvement in his life and mental health from the relationship, turning things around to everyone's benefit. But Khan still doesn't accept this development as he hates the idea of his family underachieving in anything. The idea that his mother is in a relationship with Bill puts that guy on his level, forcing the two to spend time together as a family. But one of the main reasons Bill was viewed as so pathetic was due to his inability to take care of himself, physically or otherwise. With Leoma around, he improves as a person, but that previous image of the man still remains in Khan's mind, as it does to the audience as well. Despite the ending of this episode, Leoma does not become a recurring character, and Bill remains just as miserable as he's been since the beginning of the show. The Witches of East Arlen. After losing a part in a play, Bobby starts to sulk over his lack of a thing that makes him unique. So Hank takes Bobby to a flea market to find a new hobby, where he comes across a deck of tarot cards. While searching for more material on them, he meets Ward, who invites him to hang out with the Coven of Artemis at his mother's house. Hank is thrilled about Bobby having a new friend group and doesn't pry too much into his son's life until he notices Bobby skipping a football game to dance around in the woods in a robe. He tries to shut down Bobby's new interest, telling his son that the guys are nerds, but this only makes Bobby double down and try to get more involved with the group. And the cult ultimately asks Bobby to drink dog's blood at a ceremony during the next full moon. While looking for a way out of this, John Redcorn discovers what's about to happen, and he warns Hank of the ceremony, with the two heading out to put a stop to it. But they don't arrive until afterwards, where Bobby has realized that the guys were nerds after he refused to drink the blood and got destroyed by the wizards, really just the guys making weird noises at him. In the end, Hank decides that it's alright if Bobby hasn't found his thing yet, as he still has plenty of youth. This episode starts out with the bog standard Bobby gets into a weird hobby plot that so many King of the Hill episodes have been using since the beginning. The difference instead comes from the episode's end. Rather than Hank's advice being the thing to get Bobby out of a disastrous situation, Bobby himself is the one to realize that his new friends are posers, and that he's better off without them. Hank telling him to stay away from the group is, like any advice given to a teenager, the thing that pushes him further into the circle. And why wouldn't it? From Bobby's ignorant perspective, Hank is the hypocrite here. At first, he's pushing Bobby to hang out with new people and find a new hobby that facilitates this. He's even happy with Bobby coming home late and skipping social events to spend time with them. So after Bobby does exactly what his father wants, he's then told that he shouldn't have done that and that his new friends aren't good enough. Hank is right in this situation, but as Bobby doesn't yet know just how detached from reality the Coven of Artemis is, it merely comes across as Hank trying to force Bobby to be more like him. A lesson Hank should have learned is pointless to enforce by now, just as much as Bobby should have understood that his father's advice is worth following. Season 8. If Season 7 was a return to the form of the early, character-centric episodes of King of the Hill, then Season 8 is an attempt to rebuild off of what the show had regressed back to. The more down-to-earth realism being re-established, the writers now had the chance to start thinking outside the box with what their characters did, with the perspective of what it may look like should they go off the rails again, and with this knowledge, how to avoid it. Season 8 took the stories in directions further from the mundane that Season 7 did, though with care not to make anything too absurd occur for fear of the show forgetting its roots, what made it so beloved in the first place. And while there is far less in terms of memorable set pieces going forward, this only allows the characters themselves to shine through more thoroughly, because having crazy situations and settings is only a shallow means of attracting interest. Good character writing is how you keep that interest. In this way, King of the Hill has begun to retread the style of some of the earlier seasons following the first, and attempts to do so in such a way as to avoid being repetitive. After so many seasons, most shows would start to either decline in quality or wear out their welcome, and using this technique, King of the Hill tries to avoid both of these pitfalls, but it's one thing to attempt to stay fresh, and another to succeed. Patch Boomhauer. Boomhauer finds out his younger brother, Patch, is getting married and returning to Arlen for the wedding. Later on, Boomhauer learns who the bride-to-be is, Catherine, an old love of his. He's torn about his younger brother's wedding, but accepts when Patch offers him the position of best man. But when Boomhauer catches Patch trying to hit on Luanne and tells him off, the ensuing fight causes Patch to offer Hank the best man position instead, as well as Hank being put in charge of planning the bachelor party. But later on, Boomhauer is trying to warn Catherine about his brother's behavior, and Hank tells him off, assuming he's trying to break up the wedding. Boomhauer attends the bachelor party in an attempt to make things right again, only for a group of exotic dancers that Patch hired to arrive at Hank's house for the party. The bachelorette party walks in on this moment, and Patch acts as though they were Boomhauer's idea when his fiancée looks disgusted. After this incident, Hank asks Boomhauer for the truth, and Boomhauer tells him that it was not him. But before Hank can reveal the truth to the wedding, Catherine herself admits that the gesture of Boomhauer hiring the woman reminded her that she still had feelings for her old love. At this, Patch reveals that they were his idea, and Catherine's disgusted enough to call off the wedding. In the end, Boomhauer and Catherine say their goodbyes, and Boomhauer asks Hank if he'll be his best man if he ever gets married. There are a lot of misunderstandings in this episode, not just in the sense that it's difficult to understand what the Boomhauers are saying, but that other people willingly assume the worst about each other leading up to the wedding. And yet, while so many other shows would have ridden the misunderstandings to a logical breaking point and then beyond, Hank Hill stands out by simply asking Boomhauer if his assumptions are right and then believing his best friend of 30 years when he says they're not. Because to Hank, the real issue with all the perceived actions was the fact that he was lied to by a friend. It's telling that this episode can play with audience perceptions in this way. One would have expected the wacky misunderstandings to continue as more and more people turn against Boomhauer. But Hank is quick to believe in his friend's good nature to put an end to the bad blood that could have formed. And then again, Catherine saying that it was actually romantic for Boomhauer to try to break up their wedding causes a second shock, only for the hypocrisy of Patch to reveal itself as he not only admits that he lied to make his brother look bad, but was willing to cheat on a woman he was engaged to as well. Reborn to be wild. Upset with Bobby's latest music obsession, Hank takes his son to a Christian youth group to straighten him out. A youth group that ends up being a bunch of skateboarders who praise Jesus using punk rocker aesthetics led by Pastor K. Bobby starts to get more involved with his religion, though Hank has some problems with the clothing style and skateboarding that his son is adopting. Yet when he tries to stop Bobby from dressing the way he is, the rest of the alley considers it a censure of his religion, telling Hank off for trying to stop Bobby from worshipping in his own way. Around the same time Bobby gets grounded for getting an ear piercing, Bobby also gets invited to a Christian rock concert to perform on stage, and Hank forbids him from going. After Bobby sneaks out anyway, Hank moves out to stop his son from attending, and there meets Pastor K's father, a roadie for one of the bands, who tells his son that he shouldn't try to tell Hank how he ought to be worshipping. Hank takes Bobby home and shows him all of the old fads that he used to buy into, lamenting that he had feared religion would go the same way once Bobby decided skateboarding was no longer cool. Meanwhile, the rest of the alley finds out about last meals for death row inmates and plans to make a last meal of their own, but when it comes time to actually eat all of the food, they're too paranoid to consume any. Hank struggles to verbalize what it is that he has a problem with during this episode. While getting Bobby further into religion is something that he was pushing for at the start, it wasn't so much that he wanted Bobby to be faithful, but that he wanted his son to be faithful in the same way as him. The purpose wasn't to push Bobby towards a religion, but to push Bobby towards the moral lessons taught by that religion. It was the end result that he wanted, for Bobby to be as upstanding a citizen as he is, with the same code of honor. And so this is closer to the reason that Hank dislikes the way in which his son is adopting Christianity. He wanted Bobby to be a more traditional son, and thought of his faith as being a middle ground to get to that point. But instead, the middle ground was all that was adopted, the end result being different than what he'd intended. And this is ultimately what Hank has an issue with. If the purpose of his religion has to do with something other than what Hank views as its core tenets, then it's a faith made on a shaky foundation, and thus one that can be passed over as with any fad. New cowboy on the block. A new neighbor moves into Rainy Street, Willie Lane, a retired Dallas cowboy with the Super Bowl ring to prove it. The guys are ecstatic about having a football player living nearby and head over to watch games with him, as well as driving the guy to work. But after a Cowboys victory, he throws a party which lasts all night, keeping the neighborhood up with the noise and disconnecting Khan's phone line when he calls to complain about the noise level. Hank is hesitant to tell the guy to calm down for a while until Khan's lawn is vandalized, and Willie starts a fire when Hank tries to make him answer for it. But the police are too infatuated by the Super Bowl ring to enforce the law, always taking Willie's side when they get called over, and even believing the story that Hank pushed an old car onto his own lawn. But when Khan insults Willie and the retired football player tries to start a fight, Hank ends up taking a punch to the face. But as Willie's Super Bowl ring has left an imprint on Hank's face, the block now has irrefutable evidence of the assault charge that they used to convince Willie to pack up and leave or face legal retaliation. Hank starts off this episode infatuated with an idol of his, the fictional football star Willie Lane. Although Willie's only career accomplishment is blocking a field goal attempt and being on a Super Bowl team, two things that are enough in Hank's eye to override anything else that the guy does. Because to Hank, the position of being in the public's perception is enough that the person ought to behave in a similarly majestic way in all else they do. He considers people to be all good or all bad, no compartmentalization that a terrible person can do one great accomplishment, or even considering whether playing a sport well counts as a heroic deed worthy of that praise. But as the episode goes on, Hank sees himself changing sides and going up against the people who recently held the same opinions as he did. At first, he believes that a football star can do no wrong, while Khan doesn't care about the sport and thus does not have the same hang-up. A noisy neighbor is a noisy neighbor. But after Hank comes around on the idea that Willie Lane isn't all that great, he has to go up against his old friends, who held the same opinion that he did only a few hours before. And ultimately, the episode is concluded by finally gathering the evidence to convince the police of the same mistake, and conflating morality with greatness. The Incredible Hank. Peggy is put on the planning committee for Arlentinos Day, a day celebrating Arlen's Latin American heritage that includes a bull run. But Hank is too stressed from work to focus on her talking about the event, and later, when Hank learns that Bobby is failing gym class, they go to the doctors, and the doctor suggests that Hank has irritable male syndrome. He prescribes some testosterone to treat the issue, something Hank refuses, although Peggy fills the prescription anyway and secretly puts it in his food. Over the next few days, Hank becomes more and more energetic, gaining muscles, acne, and picking fights with the other guys. He becomes so active, in fact, that he volunteers to raise money through sponsorships for the insurance at Arlentinos Day so that they can have a bull run without a protective fence. But Hank later learns that Bobby failed gym class due to not wanting to shower, and that Peggy has been drugging his food, that his energy, and subsequent lack of it, is the result of the pills. So hoping to set a better example for Bobby, Hank decides to run in the event without the help of testosterone, encouraging Bobby to overcome the showering he's nervous about. Through the show, we've seen Hank Hill repeatedly regret the person that he was in his youth, that he was too hormonal and behaved in a way that adult Hank feels ashamed of. In this episode, the testosterone doses cause him to return to that level of overconfidence and energy, volunteering to run with the bulls without spending much time thinking about whether it's a good idea or not. Despite the immaturity of saying things without considering them, he still manages to salvage the behavior by following through with it anyway. Because to Hank, being a man means sticking to a strict code of honor, whether it's a good idea or not. And this is the lesson he's attempting to impart onto Bobby, who is on the opposite end of the testosterone spectrum as Hank. While Hank is glad to be out of puberty and more mature than that, Bobby is equally far from the raging hormones of that age in a boy's life. But this, to Hank, is viewed as an issue. And part of the reason this isn't a hypocritical concept is the fact that it takes going through that awkward phase of puberty to understand why it's more important to behave as an adult. Hank feels ashamed of his actions during his second puberty, but still wants Bobby to undergo a similar event so that his son, too, can learn from experience. Flirting with the Master. When Peggy learns that the actor who plays Latin television sensation Monsignor Martinez, Eduardo Felipe, is visiting Arlen, she pretends to teach a class with sick children so that he might pay a visit to her school. While there, he asks Peggy if she would be interested in flying to Mexico to tutor his children so they can enroll in an American private school, and after convincing Hank, she agrees. But while she's being hosted, Eduardo gifts her with homemade wine, passion fruit, and he speaks familiarly with Peggy, leading her to believe that he's flirting. She attempts to flirt back, thinking that his wife is dead, and the two start to grow closer over the trip until he asks her to place some roses on his bed, though when Peggy confronts the man, saying that she's happily married to Hank, he reveals that the flowers were not for her, but his wife, and that Peggy is too old for him to find attractive. Heartbroken, she returns home, only to find that Hank has given her a surprise. His and her sinks. In the B-plot, Luanne tries to replace Peggy while she's away, only to take her duties too seriously. Peggy and Hank have their relationship tested in this episode, starting with Hank's awkwardness around romance in comparison to Eduardo's frankness about intimacy. Hank is too embarrassed to be seen kissing his wife in the airport, giving her an awkward handshake instead, whereas Eduardo doesn't seem to have any reservations about being physically close or showering her with gifts. And through this, we see the differences in the relationship Peggy dreams about and the one that she has. She believes that she's being whisked away to Mexico for a romantic Latin excursion, but this is something that she rejects in favor of Hank, who has comparatively been showing very little in terms of affection. But it's not intimacy or romance that Hank offers to her. Instead, it's stability. And while this may not have the same dreamlike aspect to it as a Latin movie star's hospitality, it's still the sort of thing that Peggy prefers. She married Hank after all. Him remembering an offhand comment she made about finding his razor stubble in the sink and then using the time apart to install separate sinks is the sort of thing that Peggy really needs in her life, not someone who showers her in gifts, but in sensibility. An especially welcome refuge after the perceived rejection by Eduardo Felipe. After the mold rush. Hank enters his house into the parade of tomes to show it off to others, but while putting up a cabinet to hide some of Bobby's toys, he strikes an unguarded water pipe, causing a leak in his son's room. His insurance company comes over to inspect the damage and has his house tested for mold while repairing the drywall, but this test comes back positive, and Rob Hogan, a mold worker, comes over to search for more and more, finding infestations throughout the house. He tells the Hill family to avoid Bobby's room, then later the master bedroom, and eventually the whole house, as he and his crew tear apart more and more of the building as they keep up turning mold. But when Hank arrives at his insurance company to complain about the slow treatment and their work ruining his leg of the Parade of Homes tour, he notices the insurance agent, mold inspector, and mold exterminator all dining at the same table, bragging about the insurance-backed scam that they have going on. So Hank trains himself on how to inspect for mold, and invites himself into Rob's home, testing the air around Bill's fungus-infected feet, and threatening that he'll take the results to another insurance company to get his house evacuated as well. In the end, the Hill family gets their home back, and Hank forces the scam artist to sit through his Parade of Homes tour. Hank is the type of person to do everything by the book. That is, he follows the rules no matter how arbitrarily they seem to be, simply because he values a type of society where everyone follows the same guidelines and the world works in a predictable way. But there are others who use these exact same rules to their benefit, typically by being the ones at the top who get to write them. And as idealistic as it is to believe that all of the guidelines and laws created in society are made in such a way as to achieve the maximum possible benefit, the reality is that people in power like to stay in power, and then use that power to make sure nothing changes about this. A whole section of Hank's insurance company is involved in a mold detection scam, likely able to lobby or influence legislation in such a way as to keep themselves employed. We can see the way they're able to scare Peggy with the information about the mold levels in the house in order to keep her involved in the scam, and that they even have Hank going along with it at first. So it's not a stretch to see how this scaremongering can be used on legislative bodies within the insurance companies, who are less familiar with mold levels, in order to keep the restrictions intact and the scam going on and on. Living on Reds, Vitamin C, and Propane. One of Hank's grandmother's friends dies, leaving her an inheritance of antique furniture, so Hank rents a truck so he can deliver it to her in Arizona. He and Bobby are excited to pretend like they're truckers, keeping a schedule and stopping at truck stops. Though, as the other truckers point out, they're not really truckers just because they rented a vehicle, made worse when it's revealed that Dale, Bill, and Boomhauer stowed away in the hole and shot their way out once they ran out of water. Now behind schedule, Hank ends up falling asleep at a stop, so Bobby and the others decide to ride through the night to get back on pace, only to make a few wrong turns and wind up stranded at the top of a mountain, with no fuel and no battery. But Hank comes up with a plan to use the furniture straps for traction and gravity to power the battery, with a small amount of kerosene used to get them to the nearest truck stop. With Boomhauer navigating and Bill holding back the furniture, they manage to reverse down the mountain and make it to a diner. There, the real truckers who overheard the ordeal over the radio celebrate the deed and offer to make a convoy to escort the mirrorless truck to Arizona and back. Meanwhile, Peggy and Luanne try to write a Christmas song about Hank and Bobby, though their audience of Nancy Gribble is less than enthusiastic as she's wondering where her husband is. Hank compares the American trucker to the myth of the American cowboy, a part of the mythos of the country regarding the last few free Americans before society, at least American society, caught up to the opposite coast. With promises of the open road and sparse safety between Texas and Arizona, Hank is eager to live out the masculine dream of the American hero archetype. And yet, he learns that he can't just pretend to be a trucker after renting a vehicle, much in the same way that a belt buckle doesn't make one a cowboy. After being told off by the real truckers, he has his dreams smashed, and he's not only told that he can't be a trucker, but that he's not a real man either. And yet it's not driving a truck across a country or doing a cattle run that made the modern or classical cowboy into the idealistic archetype that got worshipped by so many modern Americans. It was what these archetypes stood for, their code of honor. Hank decrees that he's going to deliver his cargo no matter what, refusing to call for help when he's stranded, and making a difficult journey with nothing but what he's trapped with. This is what causes his honor to be retained, and what proved that he had it in him all along. Rich Hank, Poor Hank. Hank tries to take Bobby out shopping, but learns that his son doesn't know the value of $1, nor the concept of keeping one's finances to themselves. But later on, when trying to listen in on his parents discussing money, Bobby overhears that Hank has made $1,000 in one day, although he doesn't know that this was simply Hank's bonus, and extrapolates that his father is a miserly millionaire. After telling the other kids on the block about Hank's fortune, they spread a rumor that he's loaded, but no one believes this quite as much as Bobby himself, who gets frustrated with Hank's lessons on finance and steals the emergency credit card to go shopping. When Hank discovers the suspicious charges and learns what Bobby's been splurging on, he sits down with his son and actually goes through the whole budget, Bobby realizing that the Hills were not rich after all. When a jet ski that Bobby purchased gets delivered to the house, Hank decides to sell it and make Bobby pay off the difference, though a spoiled child that looks interested in it disgusts Hank enough that he's able to justify keeping it around for a year or so before they get around to selling it. So many domestic comedies have frequent episodes about the family's money troubles, The Simpsons being one of the prime comparisons made with any animated TV show, being one of the UR examples of this. But King of the Hill rarely shows the family as struggling for money. If Hank needs to buy a new truck, he can. If he needs to go on a trip, it's within their budget to do so. But this is not so much because he's well off, but because he sets a very conservative budget. This is not only meant to reflect his character, but something meant to reflect the changing eras of American culture as well. While baby boomers were often associated with the accumulation of wealth and aspirations of being better off than one's neighbors, this part of the American dream slowly eroded as people became less competitive with one another and started to view money as less of a contest and more of a par to surpass. So many cultural lessons were made about finding happiness from sources other than blind wealth, that the typical American started to view themselves less as a temporarily embarrassed millionaire and as more of a job title or description. Hank could make more money if he were willing to work a job he viewed as less honorable, pushing propane to people who don't need it, or upselling grills at his workplace, but he values his integrity too much to sell it for so small an amount. As Bobby does not yet share this ideal, it makes sense for him to be the one to misinterpret the family's finances as coming from a place of consistency rather than commodity. This is not a King of the Hill. Strickland Propane gets a permit for a new storage facility on the condition that they beautify the county in equal parts. So Hank is told by his boss to find a work of art to display near the highway. He searches a few local art dealers but is put off by their style, until Peggy volunteers to create a probot out of propane tanks. But the zoning board is not impressed by her work and declares it not art, upsetting Peggy. But when an art dealer from Dallas is invited over to make the sale, he sees the probot and is impressed, telling Peggy that he wants to buy more probots and sell them in an art show. But once the Hill family arrives at that show, they discover that she's in a two-part exhibit of outsider art, being sold as an illiterate country bumpkin alongside Jimmy Witchard. Peggy laments that she can't be a real artist and prepares to destroy the probot, until a group of people shopping at Strickland who liked the statue start to put in commissions. In the B-plot, Dale buys a suit of armor and begins to pick fights, until Bill creates a suit of his own and defends Rainy Street. The concept of art is something misunderstood by both sides of this episode, be it from the artistic insiders who deem Peggy's probot as not art due to Peggy not being an artist, or from people like Hank who view the works at the start of the episode as not art for not being appealing. On one end of the extreme is a Philistine audience who considers art something meant to tie a room together, or in this case a highway exit. If the statue is not visually appealing, it's considered controversial or not art. But this is the same exact type of mentality that says real film is about superheroes blowing each other up, or that real literature is when the book has no conflict and a happy ending. There's an idea that any visual work is supposed to look nice and make you feel nice, commonly parroted by people who don't understand art. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's the insider world of the artist community who make the same error. They view Peggy's probot as not art because it wasn't made by an artist, only to then turn around and praise her works for that exact same reason later on. Even the initial impression of the zoning board is completely neutral, the members all saying it's interesting, and then waiting for someone else to express an opinion before they voice their own. It's a definition of what real art is based on whether others believe it is so, rather than allowing any personal feelings to weigh on their judgment. And this is ultimately what defines Peggy's success by the end of the episode. The patrons of Strickland like her work on a personal level, with no regard for what others think about it, Peggy finding success purely because she showed her works to the right audience. That's what she said. A new employee at Strickland, Rich, is introduced to replace a retiree, and quickly finds himself able to make others laugh by telling off-color jokes. Except for Hank, the rest of the office finds it funny, especially Buck himself as he begins to encourage the behavior by taking the new guy along on outings with clients. But as time goes on, he starts to target people with his jokes, and they stop being quite as funny, although the victims still laugh along so as not to appear like they're being sticklers. Hank tries to solve the issue by reporting a hostile work environment, but when Miss Borginis, a lawyer, suggests that Hank file a sexual harassment suit, he's too embarrassed by that idea to go through with it. But when Hank realizes that the antics are getting in the way of helping customers, he finally decides to wash Rich's mouth out with soap, and when Buck catches him doing this, Hank creates an ultimatum. Either the antics go, or he does. Buck pretends like he never found it funny in the first place and chooses Hank, and the office celebrates by finally saying things like meat and rack with impunity. In the B-plot, Dale quits smoking only to try out alternatives until he finally reinvents smoking again. Hank fears that the new, raunchy humor being introduced into the office will make everyone look bad, and yet he rejects a potential solution to this issue as having the same result. He could have made a sexual harassment suit in order to at least threaten the language into being toned down, or at least brought up a formal complaint to make his point clear. And this is a type of thing that Hank doesn't normally balk at either. He loves rules, especially when the rules enforce a sense of decorum, and so a sexual harassment complaint on record would seem like the right response in a legal sense. But Hank's real issue is that the jokes make him look bad, and makes the whole operation seem less respectable, made worse by the fact that so many others are going along with it. So even if the suit would have been the right thing to do, it would have made Hank a pariah among Strickland propane, meaning that that sense of office decorum would have been seen as a forced solution people are made to follow against their will. Acting professionally has to be an option that people voluntarily choose, or else it's just an arbitrary set of behavioral patterns. So Hank ends up fighting office politics with office politics, physically overpowering Rich in order to win the office over to his side, where they can then stop the comments as though it were their own choice. My Hair Lady. While styling the hair of the girl in front of her during class, Luanne realizes that she doesn't want to be in college anymore and that her passion was in hairstyling. But unable to go back to beauty school, she asks Bill to tutor her in hairstyling, and manages to pass the beauty exam with his help. Soon after, she's scouted by Hotties with a Z, a trendy hair salon. But as she can't afford rent for a chair on her own, she splits the spot with Bill. But once Bill arrives, he's told that he's throwing off the vibe of the place, and they put the duo in the back. Hank gives Luanne the advice to find the most successful person at the salon and to copy them, and as the most successful man is a flamboyant homosexual, Bill and Luanne begin to imitate his mannerisms. Now, believing he's gay, Bill, or Beto, begins to get clients and works his way up alongside Luanne. But after a while he can't keep pretending, and comes out as straight, getting him fired. Hank is disgusted that Luanne didn't at least try to stand up for the guy who got her the job in the first place, and after his lecture, Luanne comes around, defending Bill in front of the other stylists. And they respond by firing her, too. In spite of this, Luanne is happy that she can stop pretending to be someone she's not, and at Hank's recommendation, gets a stylist job at Jerry's across the street. This episode marks Luanne's return to the world of styling and departure from community college, as the latter setting wasn't very utilized in her plots. But as she moves into a new position in-universe, there's time enough for one last plot involving her lack of direction in life. It's not so much that she knows she wants to be a barber, but that she has to decide what kind of barber she wants to be. Luanne's lack of an identity is the main reason why she struggles at first to find success at her new job. Since she lacks identity, Luanne ends up adopting the personality of a different stylist, one who perhaps is not an ideal role model. Bill, too, adopts an identity inconsistent with who he is as a person, becoming a gay stereotype in order to fit in. Without this identity, he was just an overweight loser, so it makes sense that he'd be eager to want to be someone else, someone who could more easily fit into the new setting. But ultimately, Bill is pretending to be a person that he's not, an ironic twist in the fact that he's a straight man pretending to be gay, with the language of the episode drawing a comparison to closeted gay men living in a conservative area. Though by the end of the episode, it's Luanne who finally decides on her future. Not so much what she wants to do, but how she wants to do it. And she realizes that it's not worth it to be a stylist if you have to abandon the people who helped you to get there. So too does Bill learn that it's not worth it to live a lie for acceptance, as it's not really you the people around you are accepting. Phish and Wildlife. Thinking that Bobby's timid nature is too much, Hank takes him on a camping trip in order to teach him some self-reliance. The plan is to catch their own food and only use what they can gather, but Bobby is struggling to get anything and begins going hungry. This is made worse when a group of hippies enters the park and begins to set up for a gathering, something that the park ranger can't do anything about, as the gathering is protected by the First Amendment. A starving Bobby enters their commune and is offered to share in their gumbo, which he eats until it runs out. Afterwards, the hippies start demanding he pay them back, and they follow Bobby to his campsite, where they steal Hank's fishing poles and later his truck. Dale and Boomhauer leave the park, and Bill joins the hippies, leaving just Bobby and Hank to figure out how to manage in the park. It's then that Bobby gets the idea to think like a hippie and determines that the group would leave if the park stopped offering services. After announcing that the clean water, outhouse pumping, and snack bar are being shut down, the hippies leave at the thought of having to catch their own food, and Bobby and Hank finish the episode by fishing together. This episode is based off of a real event, a group known as the Rainbow Family visiting a park in Texas, sparking concerns over the impact of roughly 20,000 members visiting a small town with a population of about 700, especially given that on previous years, this gathering had caused some environmental and property damage to the surrounding area, damage the Park Service feared would be too costly for the small park to handle, and that was settled in a court case where the gathering was deemed as a protected gathering. By pulling from real events, this episode grounds its message in reality, though attributing a generalized label onto a singular group ends up painting the hippies here in a worse light than the more nuanced depictions we've seen back in the first season. Hank and his friends were, at one point, characterized as the type to enjoy the commodified version of the outdoors, to buy a cooler, and considered beer and truck beds as part of living under the stars, and the hippies were depicted as being much more genuinely in touch with the environment. But in this episode, the relationships are given significantly less nuance, as Hank is made out as an extreme stereotype of an outdoorsman, and the hippies are portrayed as much more helpless, losing the existing subtlety that makes for quality satire. Cheer factor. Upset with the cheer team's lack of interest in football, Peggy volunteers to assist with the cheerleaders despite not having been one in her youth. She's quickly able to win over Principal Moss once she starts to cheer for the football team instead of doing unrelated dances, and gets put in charge where she struggles to win over audiences as she only knows a few football cheers. But after noticing that audiences respond well to violence, Peggy begins to create routines that involve beating the other team's mascot. This causes the football team to rally, until the former cheerleading coach assists Peggy in coming up with a routine to beat up McManorberry's mascot, the Fighting Irish. McManorberry refuses to continue playing, viewing the routine as a hate crime, and Peggy's removed as cheerleading coach in exchange for Arlen keeping its win. In the end, Peggy is disallowed from attending the playoffs, and the cheerleaders go back to focusing on competitions instead of football. But once the team starts to lose again, Connie breaks away from the team to lead the audience in the cheer that Peggy taught her. To Peggy, cheerleading is something meant to support the football team, the kind of organization that exists to piggyback off of another one. And in this same way, Peggy also tries to piggyback off the cheerleading squad as a way of getting her own popularity, the kind of attention she never got in her school days. The cheerleaders, including Connie, view their participation the same way. It's not something done out of principle, but something done out of a desire to fit in with an in crowd. And yet this ends up being the point of hypocrisy that Peggy makes. Because in spite of her real motivations, she still tries to say that the cheerleading squad is supposed to primarily care about the football team's victory, and while it's far from being a bad thing that a school would show some sort of unity in this way, it becomes a problem when everyone is involved for selfish reasons. So by the end of the episode, when Peggy is removed as cheer coach in exchange for the football team retaining its win, what happened is something meant to be done for the overall benefit of the team, and were she truly motivated by what she claimed to be motivated by, she would have accepted whatever it took to benefit the team. Though it's by the end of the episode that Connie finally accepts being taken off the cheerleading squad in exchange for rallying the audience, where a real moral is finally explained, as Connie is the first person to actually want to show some school spirit for the sake of school spirit, instead of the associated popularity. Dale be not proud. Race car driver John Force collapses at a race and needs a kidney transplant, which the guys on the alley pressure Dale into doing when they learn that he's a match. But Dale doesn't want to go through with it for free, negotiating a series of deals with the driver in exchange for his organ. While Dale is in the hospital, he gives Hank power of attorney, as well as instructions to be Dale for the next 3 days. Hank goes through with this, helping out with many of the more questionable ongoing deals that Dale has going on. But it's later learned that John Force didn't need the kidney after all, and that the doctors want to give it to a sick 10-year-old instead, which Hank agrees to. Dale's upset about this at first, but later on steals his own kidney and holds it hostage, negotiating with the sick kid to give up his kidney in exchange for a few random things around the room. In the end, Hank returns Dale's power of attorney, and Dale thanks him for not letting him do something stupid with his organ. In the B-plot, Bobby takes over the morning announcements and tries to be funny during them, but he can't get any laughs until Peggy agrees to be his sidekick, ringing a cowbell after each punchline and giving up the substitute teaching job to help her son. Dale ultimately trusts Hank more than he trusts himself, something not only seen at the start of the episode when Dale agrees to turn over power of authority, but also at the end when he thanks his friend for responsibly handling the kidney situation when he would have tried to sell it on the black market. From this, we can see that on a subconscious level, Dale is aware that many of his ideas and schemes are bad, and that when it comes to something life-saving, he trusts Hank with that power instead of himself. The transfer of power of attorney being a means of ensuring that he didn't try to back out of the kidney donation that he was hesitant on. The B-plot here has Bobby struggling to get laughs on the announcements, as he no longer has the ability to project comedic timing without a live audience there, relying on a loud cowbell to tell the listeners it's okay to laugh. While this functions the same as a laugh track on a sitcom, the real reason it succeeds is because Bobby himself can hear the noise. It's implied when he starts getting flustered after hearing his mother land a substitute teaching job that it was never about the new genre, but his own nerves getting into his head about his job. Peggy recognizes that it's her emotional support that's helping Bobby more than the actual cowbell. After Hank, the flood. There's a flood going on in Arlen after several consecutive days of heavy rains. Hank is certified to assist with the evacuation and to get everyone to Tom Landry Middle School for shelter. But as he's dropping off the last of the pets, he ends up stranded and goes to the dam for higher ground. In there, he sees that the dam manager has abandoned his post and has walked through the red phone scenario about opening the floodgates in case of dam damage. The dam starts to show cracking, so Hank floods a few streets in Lower Arlen to save the town. Meanwhile, Bill is at the shelter and gets put in charge once people see his army uniform, and he begins to guide people and maintain contact with emergency services. But once Hank arrives and announces his decision about the dam, the people, including Bill, turn on him, and Hank is soon arrested to keep the people content. When he tries to break out, Con betrays him, and Bill tries to figure out what to do when Hank deduces that the flood stopped days ago. He convinces Bill to let go of power and step down instead of arbitrarily extending the emergency to feel useful. Meanwhile, Peggy comes down with shelter shock and regresses to a childlike state, while Bobby and Joseph sneak into the yearbook room and submit fake club photos. People in this episode begin to panic given the emergency situation and look towards any sign of authority that they can, diverting their attention to Bill once he's put in charge, no matter what kind of leader he actually is. From here, most of the episode's conflict comes from Bill trying too hard to please a crowd, willing to go along with whatever he says, and as a result, ends up being held to whatever the crowd wants. When they get mad at Hank for flooding the neighborhood, Bill throws his friend under the bus, instead of allowing Hank to defend his actions or explain his logic. He's also willing to put people in further danger as they begin to run low on supplies, despite the flood being over. Hank in this episode also goes through a variant on what is known as the trolley problem, where one has to make a decision to make a small sacrifice in exchange for a bigger crisis being averted. The question is raised as to whether an immoral action, either flooding a street or diverting a trolley to run over a man, is viewed as a lesser evil than no action, resulting in greater flood damage or a large number of casualties. The crowd, in their panic, views inaction as a better alternative, even defending the man who had abandoned his post to continue to attack Hank, who remained calm and level-headed. And this level-headedness is also what allows him to figure out Bill's real motivations for his methods of ruling the shelter, rather than trying to figure out a personal vendetta. Dale Tech. Cotton is staying with the Hill family for a while, and Peggy convinces Hank to enroll him in a seniors' daycare center to keep him out of their way. But when he's throwing a tantrum there, the local police are impressed with his strength and give him a job as a civilian on patrol, an honorary position with no actual authority, though Cotton doesn't see it that way. Meanwhile, Dale tries to run Dale Tech, charging people for his services monitoring the alley. But he views Cotton patrolling the streets as a threat to his business, so when Hank gives Cotton some busy work of finding out who drank his juice, Dale conspires to turn the neighborhood against Cotton by implicating everybody, then having him spy on a meeting where they air their grievances. After hearing everyone badmouth him, Cotton realizes that the power went to his head and is relieved of his responsibilities, returning to the senior care center depressed. But Dale, feeling bad about demotivating Cotton, tries to replace the spark in the guy when Cotton realizes that Hank's pillow smells like Con, and that the real busy work task earlier of finding out who drank his juice had a real culprit. In the end, Dale and Cotton learn that Con and Min have been fooling around in the Hill's house, and they threaten him to install a privacy hedge in front of his bathroom in exchange for their silence. There have been episodes before about Cotton's lack of purpose in the real world following his military career, but this episode shows this relationship through the perspective of an outsider, learning that same lesson, in this case, Dale. He sabotages Cotton's career as a civilian patrol in order to support his own interests, not realizing how much the position meant to Cotton, as it was all he had left as far as usefulness. Dale is genuinely surprised when he sees how depressed Cotton was after losing his hat and whip, expecting the guy to land on his feet and find a new fixation. But that new fixation doesn't come, as it's had decades to manifest to no success. This, combined with Cotton losing all of his friends to old age, means that Dale ended up taking away the only thing Cotton had going for him. But the episode manages to salvage everything without some grand apology, and with each character involved getting what they want out of the deal. It wouldn't be enough to simply give Cotton his hat back, he would have to earn it. And Dale doesn't have to sacrifice Dale Tech except for on his own terms, getting one job in before shutting it down for good. How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Alamo. Bobby's history class begins their section on Texas history and gets new textbooks alongside these lessons. Hank helps him to study for his first Texas history test, but Bobby ends up failing it when none of the material he was taught is on the test itself, and after going through the new books, Hank finds out that barely any of it has to do with the history he was taught. When Hank meets another frustrated man, Bruce Tuttle, at a school board meeting, they team up to recreate the Battle of the Alamo, in order to ensure that a more accurate version of events gets taught. Bobby is involved in the reenactment as extra credit to make up for his failing grade, and Hank works on the set alongside the alley. But on the day of the reenactment, Hank learns that Tuttle's version of events paints the characters of the story in a less than heroic light, and Hank prepares to sabotage the play. But when Dale compares their destruction of the Alamo to General Santa Anna, Hank decides not to stifle the man's right to tell his story, and simply states the facts before the play instead. In the end, Bobby fails Texas history anyway, as he wrote the real version of events in his textbook. In the B-plot, Nancy receives a flat Stanley in the mail, and Peggy takes it around Arlen, destroying Stanley in an attempt to teach harsh life lessons. Truthfully, Hank's knowledge of the historical events surrounding the founding of Texas is no more or less valid than Bruce Tuttle's. The truth is that we don't know the exact events and characters of all the people involved, and many of the gaps are filled in with whatever information we know for sure. The historical events include the fact that the Alamo was attacked by the Spanish forces, and the men were all killed, this event later inspiring other Texans to continue the fight and eventually win. So this narrative gets supported by the people involved being more heroic figures, that they fought to the death for their ideals. Tuttle's play challenges the existing idea of the character of the men at the Alamo, but takes it far too far in the opposite direction and portraying the people there as cowardly and drunk. Ultimately, this is no less valid, even if it doesn't make for a good story, and Hank ends up taking this lesson away. Not to stifle the ideas of the people you disagree with, but to tell both sides of the events and allowing the audience to decide which version is the most interesting. Something the non-committal messaging of Bobby's textbooks failed to do by not even bringing up the controversy. Girl, you'll be a giant soon. Hank Hill tries to enter the grilling competition at the Texas State Fair, only to learn that they do not accept propane there. Luanne is tired of being treated like a child and wants to do something more grown up, so she listens to Hank vent about his propane issue and convinces him to start up a propane protest next to the grillers to give the gas an equal chance. But her attempts to recruit more members for the protest only gather a few aimless college students, who host a die-in and wind up making propane look even worse. Hank, upset by Luanne's naivety, tells her off, so Luanne commandeers Big Tex and begins shouting her slogans from the giant, hoping to make Hank proud. He's unable to get her to come down until he realizes that he's been treating her like a child, finally diffusing the situation by offering to talk it out like adults. Meanwhile, the alley is bored without Hank, and they offer Bobby the position of new Hank, telling them what to do, while Peggy and her friends try to view a murder house, only to be told to leave as their buy offer isn't serious. Luanne is tired of being treated like a kid and wants to find something that she views as more mature to keep her occupied while also earning the respect of others. But not knowing what this really entails, she just goes to the first person willing to sit down and talk with her, who happens to be a Hank too concerned with his grievances to care how the conversation with Luanne is. With both people more concerned with themselves than the other's involvement, the situation spirals into a misunderstanding as Hank tries to protest and Luanne tries to get Hank's respect, neither one communicating with the other and merely guessing what it is that they want. And this lack of empathy is what drives many of the other actions through the episode. The protesters following Luanne's lead are only doing so in an attempt to woo her. They have no idea what they're actually protesting against, as they're only involved for the clout. No different from Luanne, although Luanne is trying to earn this clout for her sake by impressing Hank, so it's more well-intentioned than trying to sleep with someone. In the end, most of the characters spend more time trying to prove things than they do thinking about why they're trying to prove that thing in the first place, or who they're proving it to. Stressed for success. Hank is tired of Bobby watching so much television, so he makes his son enroll in an after-school program. When he hears from Connie that the middle school quiz bowl team is struggling, he joins up as their pop culture guy. With Bobby's help, the team is able to get into a winning streak, but despite Bobby's confident performance, the other members of the team all study constantly, as their college aspirations depend on the team's success. While at the Megalomart's electronics section, Bobby has a panic attack as he tries to remember too much trivia at once and collapses. So Peggy and Hank try to come up with a way to calm him down to no success. It's not until Bobby considers quitting the team that his stress level finally starts to go down again. But despite Hank's disapproval of Bobby joining the Quiz Bowl team in the first place, he still shuts down the idea to quit, as he believes Bobby should go through with the commitment. In the end, Bobby accepts that it's okay to feel a bit of stress and returns to studying once more. Bobby's pop culture consumption ends up getting him recognized in this episode, though not for the right reasons or by the right people. Rather than the Quiz Bowl team recognizing his contributions, they instead place more and more pressure on him to continuously perform the best instead of his best. As it's a talent recognized for its benefit to others, rather than recognized for what it is, he does not get the satisfaction from his hard work that it seems he ought to be getting. This is one of the things that can lead to stress, one's work not being recognized unless it's gone. Pop culture knowledge is viewed throughout this episode by Hank as something less worthy of recognition than most other interests or hobbies, but to Bobby it is serious business. It shows that stress doesn't come from what you're doing, but from the conditions under which you're doing it. Once Hank starts to compare Bobby's quiz bowl pursuits in a more serious light, he's finally able to start empathizing with his son and is able to give him reasonable advice. As long as Bobby is only concerned with impressing himself, then it doesn't matter what others think of him, but despite that, he should still be trying. Hank's back, or the unbearable lightness of being Hank. Hank throws out his back at work, and his doctor recommends either going on workman's comp to rest up or taking pain relievers. But Hank refuses both of these and stubbornly tries to return to work, only to collapse and fill out the application anyway. In spite of the skepticism of the government agencies trying to make sure he's genuinely incapacitated, he gets approved for comp and spends the next few days recovering. But Hank can't bear to spend so long out of work, and so he finally agrees to do some yoga to stretch once again. His instructor, Yogi Victor, is obnoxious, but the new stretches work and Hank is soon able to walk again, just in time for the lawyer investigating his case to get photo evidence. Accused of fraud, Hank has to defend himself, but with no evidence to support his claims, he simply invites Yogi into the courtroom, claiming that one would have to be genuinely suffering to put up with the man for more than a few minutes. In the B-plot, Peggy tries to revitalize her old grocery store by bagging there, only for her service not to be enough to compete with Megalo, who puts them out of business. Hank attempts to personify American ideals by working through his pain, ironically only to make his work look worse as he ends up causing issues for Strickland. He refuses to use any of the systems in place to mitigate his pain, instead allowing himself to suffer unnecessarily because of his own sense of pride. Hank is ultimately forced to attend yoga classes long-term in order to maintain his health, something that he could have avoided if he'd simply accepted taking a few days off of his job. Instead, his pride is forced to put up with Yogi Victor for even longer. So this episode ends up showing off some of the negative sides of the traits that normally make Hank look good. His insistence on valuing work ethic above common sense, making things drag out longer than they ought to. Peggy's subplot does a similar thing, her customer service and bagging being far less interesting than the lower prices of the Megalo. In the end, neither Hank nor Peggy are able to get what they want in the way that they want it, their idealism smashing against the reality of the situation as they learn harsh lessons through their failures. Some problems cannot be solved by hard work and a can-do attitude, and trying to pretend like they can fix everything will only make the people inevitably failing due to reasons outside their control feel as though it's their fault. The Redneck on Rainy Street. After Connie gets rejected from a collegiate summer program for being just another smart Asian, Con grows frustrated, eventually catching the attention of Elvin Mackleston, who teaches Con about being his own boss and not taking the worst parts of the world. After this, Con decides to stop going to work and to drink beer all day like the rest of the alley, convincing men to go along with him. They enjoy this new carefree lifestyle for a few weeks, but Connie hates it, staying with the Hill family as Con and Min head out to do a variety of white trash things without her. Eventually, Hank and Peggy learn that the bank is planning to foreclose on their home as they missed a payment, and after leaving Con for trying to break into a record store, Min learns about this and decides to get her act together. But Con is still rejecting the button-down lifestyle and plans on going sticking with his new friends, getting hit on the head with a piece of lumber while others bet on it. Hank rushes out to save him, but Con refuses to listen until Hank brings up Connie. Realizing that Connie is no longer just another smart Asian girl, but a smart Asian girl from a troubled family, Con goes back to Rainy Street and back to work, with Connie using the experience to get into the summer program. Con laments that his family escaped a brutal dictatorship to come to the land of opportunity, doing everything they were supposed to do to find success and happiness, only to realize that that success has already been distributed, and the family is just another among the millions wanting the same thing. Realizing that this version of the American dream has long since been done away with, Con decides to follow a different dream, one where your aspirations can't be crushed because you have none. But it's only Con who's given up on this lifestyle. Connie still wants to work hard at it and earn her way up in the world. It's this constant motivation that forces Con to remember why he was working hard in the first place, not just for himself, but for his family as well, a family that he nearly lost in the pursuit of his own happiness. Con is also frustrated with the idea that less deserving kids are getting into colleges ahead of Connie due to quotas at the schools that they're trying to reach, upset that they don't care purely about grades but where the grades are coming from, which is a misunderstanding about what the quotas were meant to do regardless of their success. They're meant to reward the hardest working students, not the hardest working parents. Some kids born into conditions that make their achievements less impressive, others into conditions that make even moderate achievements stand out, as Connie manages to take advantage of in this episode. Talking Shop. It's elective sign-up time, and Bobby and Joseph have decided to take something that will allow them to meet girls. But Hank insists that Bobby take auto shop instead, as the peer counseling course that he wants to take is too sensitive, and Hank thinks the repair skills will come in more handy. But Bobby signs up for the peer counseling course anyway, only to learn that he's not allowed to date clients or other counselors. Despite this, he still manages to get a date with one of the girls, Ginny, keeping it hidden from the teacher. Later, he encourages another girl, Stacy, to break up with her boyfriend, and she begins to fall for Bobby instead. Stacy starts to stalk Bobby, a feeling he does not reciprocate, and he tries to flee the girl, finding no help from the teacher or his peers. Meanwhile, Hank has assumed that Bobby is enrolled in auto shop and looks for a beaten-up car that he and his son can repair together. But after he finds the right one, Hank learns about Bobby's predicament, and when Stacy arrives at the Hill household throwing eggs at the window, Hank takes her and Bobby into the garage and has them fix up the car together, with the two talking through their problems over the hood. It's assumed throughout the episode that Hank Hill has problems working through his emotions as he shuts down Bobby's attempts to take a more sensitive subject, pushing him towards working with his hands. And so when Bobby tries to take a subject to meet girls, he's shown as being more in touch with his sensitive side, something girls ought to like. But the reality is that some of the girls he spoke with were really only attracted to the sense of power, the dynamic between them shaping the relationship that they had. And so Bobby was not truly in touch with any sensitive side of himself, merely putting on an act that was enough to fool some vulnerable girls right up until the point that they realized his true intentions, shown when Jenny breaks up with him for what she saw him do to Stacy. Hank would have had Bobby do something viewed as more macho than peer counseling, the assumption being that Hank wants Bobby to refuse his emotions and to bottle them up, as Hank has done so many times in the past. But in the end of the episode, Bobby and Stacy have a normal conversation, no power dynamics or ulterior motives in the way. So from this and Hank's recollection of the many other emotional issues that have been resolved over a broken down car, we can see that Hank does not reject his emotions at all. He simply uses auto repair as a way of working through his problems, talking things out with a wrench in hand. Outro. This was part 2 of a 3-part series covering King of the Hill. The third part will come out eventually, and the finished video will be out along with it. This whole section will be cut out of the inevitable full version of the video though, so it serves as a finale to what's not really an end. Although it's still an end to this section, so I want to at least thank you for sticking with the video this long, knowing it's not going to end with a completion of the show. Maybe you sat through the whole thing in one sitting, maybe you skipped around a lot, maybe you just have the video on in the background while doing something else, in which case this is your heads up to start looking for another long-form video to listen to in the background. I would suggest one of my own, but of course I'm biased in this decision. Dang it, Bob.